Hello guys, welcome to Watch Harry. Today we have an incredible story for you. Goblin healer found 8 Horcruxes worth of dark magic in Harry's scar and dragged Dumbledore to trial. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The audit. The letter arrived at Hogwarts on a Tuesday, which Dumbledore would later reflect was perhaps the most unremarkable detail of what turned out to be a very remarkable week. It came by Goblin courier, not owl post, which was itself unusual enough to make McGonagall pause when she found it on her desk before breakfast. The envelope was made of something that wasn't quite parchment, a stiff grey material that felt faintly warm to the touch, sealed with dark green wax stamped with the Gringotts crest. The letter inside was written in the precise, angular script that goblins favored, each letter carved rather than drawn, and it informed Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry that pursuant to Section 14, Subsection 7 of the Magical Health and Artifact Containment Accords of 1847, recently amended and renewed by the International Confederation of Wizards in 1994, Gringotts Bank would be conducting a mandatory health audit of all students currently enrolled at wizarding educational institutions across Britain. The audit, it further explained, was non-negotiable, non-deferrable, and would commence this Friday at 9 in the morning. McGonagall read it twice, then brought it to Dumbledore. Dumbledore read it once, set it down, and said, "How interesting," in a tone that gave absolutely nothing away, which was itself a kind of answer. Friday arrived grey and damp, the kind of October morning that felt like the castle was exhaling cold breath through its stone walls. The great hall had been partitioned at the far end, not by magic, but by actual physical dividers the goblins had brought themselves, portable screens of that same warm grey material that seemed to absorb sound. For examination stations had been set up, each with a low table, instruments that looked nothing like anything in Madame Pomfrey's infirmary, and a goblin healer in dark green robes who had arrived at 7 and spent 2 hours setting up before anyone at Hogwarts thought to offer them tea. Nettlefang Ashgrip had not wanted tea. She had wanted, and had received, a complete list of all currently enrolled students sorted by year, age, and any previously documented magical anomalies. She'd reviewed it on the carriage ride from London, annotated it in the margins with a scratching quill that seemed to write faster than her hand was moving, and by the time she walked through the great oak doors of Hogwarts she had already identified 11 students who warranted closer examination based on their files alone. Harry Potter's name had 3 asterisks next to it. She hadn't put them there. They'd been in the file when it was handed to her, added by the senior archivist at Gringotts, which told her that whoever had flagged this file had been thinking about it for a while. The notation beside the asterisks read only, Scar. Lightning bolt. Unknown curse origin. No formal Gringotts assessment ever conducted. Nettlefang had read that and felt something in her professional instincts tighten like a wire being drawn taut. No formal assessment. The boy had been living at Hogwarts for 5 years. He was arguably the most famous magical person in Britain, the subject of a prophecy that half the ministry spent their careers pretending didn't exist, and in all that time, no one had looked at that scar with proper instruments. She set her bag down at Station 2, unrolled her instrument case on the table, and began calibrating. The students came in year groups, shepherded by prefects who had been told only that this was mandatory and that they should not be dramatic about it. The first years went through in a nervous clump, most of them so intimidated by the goblin healers that they forgot to be frightened of the instruments. The second and third years were more curious than scared. The fourth years tried to look indifferent and mostly failed. By the time the 5th years arrived, Nettlefang had settled into the comfortable rhythm of the work. Most of what she found was ordinary, the lingering traces of jinxes and hexes that accumulated on any young witch or wizard who spent 5 years learning spells from other young witches and wizards, a few minor artifact-related residues, one girl with a worrying amount of potion-saturated magic around her hands that Nettlefang catalogued for follow-up. Nothing that made her instruments do anything other than their expected gentle, measured readings. Then Harry Potter sat down across from her. He was a thin boy, thinner than he should have been, she noted with the automatic clinical eye of someone who'd worked with human children long enough to know what malnourishment looked like even when it had mostly corrected itself. Dark hair that clearly had no relationship with any comb. Round glasses slightly bent at one hinge. Green eyes that were watching her with an expression she recognized, the careful blankness of someone who had learned to be assessed by strangers and had decided that not reacting was the safest option. "Harry Potter," she said. Not warmly, not coldly. Just fact. "Yeah," he said. Then, apparently remembering he was talking to someone official, yes. "That's me." "I know who you are," Nettlefang said. "I'm going to conduct the standard examination first. Then I'll move to the secondary assessment. It won't hurt." "What's the difference between standard and secondary?" "The standard assessment looks at general magical health, residual jinx damage, potion contamination, artifact interference. The secondary is more specific." She picked up her primary instrument, a slim rod of something that looked like dark bone with a crystalline tip that glowed faintly blue. "This will feel like a mild warmth. Hold still." Harry held still. She ran the instrument slowly from the crown of his head downward, watching the crystals glow with the focused attention of someone reading a language that most people around her didn't speak. The readings came back normal. Slightly elevated residual jinx traces, consistent with someone who got into a lot of fights, and a faint shimmer of something she catalogued as ambient prophecy resonance, which was unusual but not unheard of in individuals connected to active prophecies. Then she brought the instrument close to his scar. The crystal went dark. Not dimmed. Not reduced. Dark. Completely. As if the light had been swallowed. Nettlefang kept her face perfectly still. She pulled the instrument back 2 inches. The crystal glowed blue again, steady and normal. She brought it forward again, slowly, watching the moment the light died, approximately 4 centimeters from the scar's surface, at which point whatever was in there was simply absorbing the instrument's detection field entirely. Harry had gone very still. "Is something wrong?" "What makes you ask?" "You stopped moving." "I'm assessing," she said, and picked up her secondary instrument. This one was broader, a flat disc of the same dark material as the examination table, covered in hairline inscriptions that she activated with a murmured word in gobbledygook. It was calibrated for artifact detection, specifically for detecting magic that had been anchored, tied to a physical object or location with intent. Dark artifact work. The kind of readings she usually found at the bottom of old families' vaults, in boxes that had been sealed for generations. She held it 18 inches from Harry's scar and watched. The inscriptions lit up one by one. She counted them. Kept counting. Her expression did not change, but her grip on the disc tightened slightly, the only outward sign that what she was seeing was registering somewhere beneath her professional composure. 8 distinct anchor points of dark magic, each one layered over the others with extraordinary precision, each one registering at a density that her instruments classified as extreme hazard, equivalent to Horcrux class containment. Nettlefang set the disc down very carefully on the table. "I need to ask you some questions," she said. "Before I continue." Harry's careful blankness had developed a crack in it. Something behind his eyes had shifted toward wariness. "What kind of questions?" "When did you receive the scar?" "When I was a baby. 1 year and 3 months old." "Voldemort," he said the name without flinching, she noted. "Tried to kill me." The curse rebounded. "Has anyone, any healer, any magical assessment practitioner, examined the scar itself?" "Not the wound. The magical residue within it." Harry frowned. "Madame Pomfrey's looked at it when it's hurt." "Professor Dumbledore said," he paused. "I don't think anyone's done what you're doing." "Has it always hurt?" "No. It started hurting again 2 years ago. Gets worse when he's nearby, or angry." He was watching her face the way you watch someone's face when you're trying to read news they haven't delivered yet. "What are you finding?" Nettlefang looked at him for a moment. He was 16 years old. He had the eyes of someone who had been braced for bad news for so long that good news had started to seem less trustworthy than bad. She made a decision, the kind of decision she'd been making her entire career, the decision between professional detachment and simple human decency. "I'm finding something I need to examine more thoroughly before I can characterize it properly," she said. "I'm going to need you to come back this afternoon. After the standard sessions are finished." "Is it bad?" "I don't speculate before I have complete data," she said. "That's not evasion. That's accuracy. Come back at 4. Harry looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded and stood up. He paused at the edge of the screen. "You're going to tell me the truth this afternoon? Whatever it is?" Nettlefang picked up her instrument case and began changing settings for the next student. "That is the only thing I do," she said. She spent the rest of the morning and all of lunch in a controlled state that she would have characterized, if anyone had asked her, as professionally focused. She examined the remaining 5th years, then the 6th, then the 7th, noted 3 more follow-up cases, completed all the standard documentation, signed the preliminary audit forms in triplicate, handed them to the Gringotts courier who had been waiting in the corridor outside with the patient, blank-faced endurance of someone paid to wait in corridors. Then she sat at her station with Harry Potter's file open on the table in front of her and thought. In 31 years of practice, Nettlefang had seen 2 confirmed Horcruxes. The first had been brought to Gringotts in a box by a ministry official who had found it in a confiscated property, a small journal that radiated malevolence like a heat source, that had left the junior healer who first touched it with nightmares for 6 months. The senior archivist had triple-sealed it and sent it to the Department of Mysteries within the hour. The second had been a cup. She'd only seen photographs, but the readings on the photographs alone had made her instruments register alarm. A Horcrux was a specific thing. It was a container, an object, a living thing, something physical, into which a fragment of a human soul had been deliberately placed after being split from the whole through an act of murder. The process was dark magic of a complexity and a cost that very few practitioners in history had been willing or able to perform. What she had found in Harry Potter's scar was not 1 Horcrux. It was not 2, or 3, or the theoretical maximum that most dark artifact scholars put at 4, beyond which the soul's fragmentation supposedly became too severe to sustain coherent magical function. It was 8 distinct anchors of soul fragment magic, and she was almost certain that Harry Potter himself was not aware that any of them existed. She opened a fresh sheet of documentation parchment and began to write. Harry came back at 4 with Hermione. Nettlefang looked at the girl, brown hair, sharp eyes, expression of someone who had spent 5 minutes in the corridor preparing exactly what to say if anyone tried to turn her away, and said, "You're not on my patient list." "I'm Harry's friend," Hermione said. "I'm not here as a patient. I'm here as support," Harry said. "She's here as support. Is that all right?" Nettlefang considered them. The girl was clearly brilliant, the type who wanted information the way other people wanted air. And the boy clearly trusted her in a specific, load-bearing way. "She can stay," Nettlefang said, "on the condition that she doesn't speak until I've finished explaining what I found. After that, she can ask as many questions as she likes." Hermione opened her mouth, then closed it with visible effort and sat down. Harry sat across from Nettlefang. The great hall was empty now, the partition screens making their small corner of it feel separate from everything else, a space that existed slightly outside normal school time. "I want to show you something before I explain it," Nettlefang said, and activated the detection disc again. She held it at a careful angle so both of them could see the inscriptions from where they sat. She moved it slowly toward Harry's forehead, and they watched together as, one by one, 8 points of inscription lit up with a deep, reddish light that had nothing gentle about it. Neither of them said anything. The silence lasted long enough that Nettlefang set the disc down and waited for them to arrive at whatever they were going to arrive at. Hermione got there first. Her voice, when it came, was very controlled. "What does each point represent?" Each point represents a distinct magical anchor, Nettlefang said. An anchor is a point where a piece of magic has been fixed, tied to an object or location or living being, with deliberate, structured intent. The anchors I'm reading in Harry's scar are consistent with soul fragment containment. Another silence. Soul fragment, Harry said. Not a question. Not quite. The specific magical structure is consistent with what is documented in Gringotts artifact records, which are significantly more complete than the Ministry's, as a Horcrux. Do you know what that is? Harry shook his head. Hermione said, very quietly, it's when a dark witch or wizard splits their soul and stores a fragment of it in an object. It's how they make themselves, almost immortal. As long as the fragment exists, they can't truly die. She stopped. Swallowed. Harry. That's why he couldn't kill me, Harry said. He said it very flatly, the way you say a thing when you've been turning its shape over in your mind and it has gone from incomprehensible to simply heavy. He couldn't kill me because, he stopped. Because part of his soul was in you, Nettlefang said. That appears to be one of the anchors. But it is not the only one. There are 8, Harry said. Yes. How many are him? How many are in me? I cannot distinguish individual fragments' origins with these instruments. But the magical signature across all 8 is consistent with a single source. They all read as the same soul. Harry sat back in his chair. His face had gone very still in a way that was different from the blankness he'd had that morning. That had been practiced. This was something else, the stillness of someone in the instant before they decide something. So, he said. There are 8 pieces of Voldemort's soul in my scar. Not all of them necessarily reside in the scar itself. The scar appears to be the anchor point, the location where the original tethering occurred. Some fragments may have adhered to surrounding magical tissue. But the scar is where they're centered, yes. And nobody, Harry said slowly, has ever found this before. There is no record in any file I was given of a formal assessment of this nature ever being conducted. Dumbledore, Hermione said, and the word came out like she'd been holding it and hadn't meant to let it go. She pressed her lips together. Harry looked at her. He would have known, she said, carefully now. Wouldn't he? A man who's spent his whole life studying dark magic, who knows about Horcruxes, he would have had reason to suspect. I don't know what Professor Dumbledore knew, Nettlefang said, and her tone made very clear that she had, in fact, formed a professional opinion about exactly that. What I know is what my instruments found, what the documentation shows, and what my legal obligations are under the Accords. Harry looked at her sharply. Legal obligations? Nettlefang pulled a second document from her case. It was longer than the first, printed in that same angular goblin script, but along the top it bore 2 crests, Gringotts, and something else, a set of scales in dark green that Harry hadn't seen before. Under the Magical Health and Artifact Containment Accords, she said, any practitioner who discovers Horcrux-class dark magic anchored within a living sentient being is legally required to report their findings to the Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division, petition for emergency containment assessment, and, she paused, and there was something in that pause that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, file a formal notice of negligence against any party who held documented knowledge of the individual situation and failed to act on their legal protection obligations. Hermione stared at her. You're going to report Dumbledore. I am going to file the documentation that the Accords require me to file, Nettlefang said. What happens as a result of that documentation is not in my hands. It is in the hands of the institutions whose job it is to act on it. Harry hadn't moved. He was looking at the detection disc still sitting on the table, at the 8 points of light that had now faded but that he seemed to still be seeing. You're doing this because you have to, he said. Not because you want to make trouble for him? Nettlefang looked at him steadily. I'm doing it because you are a 16-year-old boy who has been walking around with the equivalent of 8 Horcruxes worth of dark magic in your head for 15 years, and the people responsible for your welfare knew enough to at minimum ask the question of what was in that scar, and did not ask it. She let that sit for a moment. I don't make trouble, Mr. Potter. I document facts. The facts, in this case, are extremely troubling. Harry looked at her for a long time. Something was happening behind his eyes, something shifting, resettling, finding new ground. What happens to me? He finally asked. The fragments. Can they be removed? I don't know yet. That determination will require a full specialist team. She held his gaze. But the first step is documentation. And the first person who needs to be documented as having failed in their duty of care is Albus Dumbledore. The name landed in the quiet of the partitioned space like a stone dropped into deep water. Harry nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Hermione had been very still for the last few minutes, and when she spoke, her voice had an edge that Nettlefang had not heard in it before, not the sharp edge of someone being clever, but the harder edge of someone who has reached the boundary of how much they are willing to forgive. What do you need from us? A statement from Harry, describing what he knows of his medical history in relation to the scar, what he has and hasn't been told. Nettlefang smoothed the documentation parchment on the table. And I'll need you to not speak to Professor Dumbledore about this until the filing is complete. After that, it becomes a matter of institutional record, and he'll be notified through the proper channels. How long does the filing take? Harry asked. I'll begin tonight, Nettlefang said. The initial filing will be submitted to Gringotts by tomorrow morning. The Magical Health and Artifacts Division will review within 48 hours. If they find sufficient grounds, and they will, they'll initiate proceedings. She began rolling the documentation parchment with brisk efficiency. Are you in agreement with providing a statement? Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that happens between people who have been in enough danger together that words have become a secondary language. Yes, Harry said. He gave the statement over the next hour, sitting across from Nettlefang in the empty, partitioned corner of the great hall while Hermione sat beside him and the October darkness gathered outside the high windows. He told her everything he remembered, the night his parents died, what he knew of it. The first time his scar had hurt, on a Halloween in first year when Quirrell had tried to get past the Philosopher's Stone. Quirrell's turban. What had been under it? Second year, the diary, the chamber, the basilisk, the moment he'd seen Riddle and understood something deeply wrong even if he couldn't have named it then. Third year, Pettigrew, the truth about that night in Godric's Hollow. Fourth year, and here his voice changed in a way that Hermione noticed and Nettlefang catalogued, the graveyard. The Priori Incantatem. The bone and the blood and the brief, terrible reunion with his parents echoes in the space between spells. Last year. Occlumency lessons with Snape. The connection to Voldemort's mind that had been growing stronger, clearer, more like a tunnel and less like a crack. The vision in the Department of Mysteries. Sirius. He said his godfather's name with a particular careful flatness that told Nettlefang volumes. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Hermione had her hand on the table near his, not quite touching, in the way of someone who has learned that sometimes presence is more useful than contact. Nettlefang wrote the last line of his statement, initialed it at the bottom, and slid it across the table for him to sign. I have one more question, she said. And you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. Go ahead, Harry said. When Professor Dumbledore spoke to you about the connection between you and Voldemort, about why it existed, about what it meant for the prophecy, did he ever suggest that you might need to die in order for Voldemort to be defeated? The silence stretched out long enough that it became its own answer before Harry said anything. When he did speak, his voice was very quiet. Not in so many words. But I always sort of felt like that's where it was going, Harry said. Like there was something he wasn't saying. Something at the end of the road he could see and I couldn't. Nettlefang looked at him for a moment. Then she said, simply, "That ends now." Harry blinked. It seemed to take him slightly off guard, the directness of it, maybe, or the fact that it came from someone who had no particular emotional investment in him and yet sounded entirely certain. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the moment my filing reaches Gringotts, you become the subject of a formal protection case under the Accords. That carries specific legal weight that a headmaster's strategic considerations do not override." She closed the statement folder and secured the clasp. "You will not be sacrificed for a war strategy, Mr. Potter. Not while there is a formal case open. That is not sentiment. That is Gringotts law, and Gringotts law does not care about the greater good." Harry stared at her. Hermione made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob and was neither. "You should go," Nettlefang said. "Have dinner. Don't talk to Dumbledore tonight, not because I'm asking you to lie to him, but because I'd prefer the documentation to be formally submitted before the conversation happens. If he asks how the audit went, you can tell him you're still processing it. That is, I suspect, entirely true." Harry stood. He hesitated at the edge of the screen, and she recognized the hesitation, the same pause he'd had that morning, the same moment of deciding whether to trust a stranger with something important. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "I mean, you could just report the findings and let someone else push on the Dumbledore part. You're a healer, not a lawyer or whatever." Nettlefang began packing her instruments with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had never left a worksite in disorder. "Because in 31 years of practice," she said, without looking up, "I have seen a great many witches and wizards assume that the rules which govern the care of magical beings apply to everyone except the people they've decided are important." She snapped the instrument case closed. "They are wrong. And I enjoy being the person who demonstrates that they're wrong." Harry almost smiled. It was a small thing, slightly crooked, but it reached his eyes in a way that most of his expressions that day hadn't. "Okay," he said. "Good." After they left, Nettlefang sat alone in the partitioned corner of the great hall for a moment, listening to the distant sound of hundreds of students in the corridor outside, the ordinary noise of an ordinary Friday evening at a school that did not, at this moment, know what was about to happen to it. She opened her documentation case and began to write. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping, her scratching quill moving in the candlelight with the speed and certainty of someone who had been thinking about exactly these words since 4 in the afternoon, who had been, in some sense, preparing to write exactly these words for 31 years of practice and everything she had seen in those years that she had documented and signed and closed the folder on and moved forward from. She wrote the finding. She wrote the evidence. She wrote the chain of documented knowledge, everything in Harry Potter's publicly available record that any competent magical practitioner with access to the standard archives should have been able to use to ask the right questions. She wrote the Accords clauses. She wrote the obligation of care. She wrote Dumbledore's name in the formal negligence section with the same clean, angular script she used for everything else, no flourish, no particular force. Just a name. Just a fact. At 10:30 she sealed the documents in a grey envelope with dark green wax, pressed the Gringotts healer's seal into it, and set it beside her bag. She looked out the high windows of the great hall at the dark October sky, at the stars visible between clouds. Then she blew out her candle, picked up her bag, and went to sleep on the narrow cot in the room Hogwarts had assigned to visiting practitioners, because tomorrow she had a courier to meet, and the day after that, everything was going to change. Chapter 2, The Filing. The Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division occupied the 4th sublevel of the bank, 3 floors below the main vault corridors, in a stretch of tunnel that most wizards who banked at Gringotts had never seen and would never see. It smelled of stone and old parchment and something faintly metallic that had nothing to do with gold, and it was lit by lamps that burned a steady, unflickering white that made everything look exactly as it was, no shadows, no flattering angles, no comfortable dimness to hide in. Nettlefang arrived at 7:30 Saturday morning, courier receipt in hand, and went straight to the senior archivist's office without stopping at the reception desk. Senior archivist Brasswick Thorne was 73 years old, had held his position for 41 of those years, and had the particular stillness of someone who had reviewed enough catastrophic documentation that very little surprised him anymore. He looked up from his desk when Nettlefang walked in, took in her expression and the envelope in her hand, and said, "Close the door." She did. She set the envelope on his desk. He broke the seal, unfolded the documents, and read. He read the way she'd written, without stopping, without expression, his dark eyes moving down each page with the systematic focus of someone for whom documentation was a primary language. When he finished the last page, he set it down, squared the stack carefully, and was quiet for a moment. 8, he said. 8 distinct anchor points. All registering Horcrux class density. And the subject is the Potter boy. Yes. Brasswick looked at the document stack. You're naming Dumbledore in the negligence clause. He had access to the relevant records. He had documented knowledge of the curse event. He has spent 15 years in a position of direct responsibility over this child. Nettlefang sat down without being invited. The accords are clear. The accords are clear, Brasswick agreed. He picked up the documents again and began reading the second page more slowly this time, the way you read something when you already know what it says and you're now reading it for what it means. The Ministry isn't going to like this. The Ministry isn't a party to the filing. The Ministry will make themselves a party to it within approximately 4 hours of being notified. He set the page down again and looked at her. You understand what you're starting. I understand what the evidence requires, Nettlefang said. Which is not the same question. Brasswick was quiet for another moment. Then something moved in his face, not quite approval, but the recognition of something he'd been waiting to see done for a long time. He picked up a fresh piece of parchment and began writing. I'm initiating the emergency containment review today. That means a specialist team to Hogwarts within 72 hours to assess extraction viability. He wrote quickly, the same angular script, but faster. I'm also filing the formal notification to the Wisengamot Oversight Committee under Article 9 of the Accords. That triggers the tribunal process. How long? 7 days minimum before they can convene a full hearing. Probably 10. They'll fight the timeline. He looked up. Dumbledore has friends in every corridor of every institution in this country. I know, Nettlefang said. And you're not concerned. I'm concerned about Harry Potter, she said. I'm not concerned about Albus Dumbledore's friends. Brasswick looked at her for a moment longer, then went back to writing. I'll need you available for the specialist team consultation. You're the primary examiner of record. Obviously. And I'll need you to prepare for the tribunal testimony. They'll try to question your methodology, your instruments, your qualifications. He signed the notification form with a sharp, decisive stroke. Be ready for that. I have been ready for that since I was 22 years old and the first wizard told me my instruments were probably broken, Nettlefang said. Brasswick's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. He stamped the notification with the division seal. Good. I'll have a courier dispatched to the Wisengamot Oversight Committee within the hour. He paused, the stamp still in his hand. One more thing. The boy, Potter. He knows. He knows what I found. He gave a statement. How did he take it? Nettlefang thought about Harry's face in the candlelit partition of the Great Hall, the careful stillness, the small crooked almost smile when she told him she enjoyed demonstrating that certain people were wrong. Better than most adults would have, she said. Brasswick nodded slowly. Then let's get him some answers worth having. Harry didn't sleep well. This was not especially unusual, he hadn't slept consistently well since 4th year, since the graveyard, since the feeling of Cedric's body hitting the ground had installed itself somewhere in the architecture of his unconscious mind and periodically replayed itself in the small hours. But Saturday night was a particular kind of wakeful, the kind where he wasn't fleeing nightmares but simply lying in his four-poster with the curtains closed and the dormitory quiet around him, thinking. 8. He kept coming back to 8. Not the concept of a Horcrux. Hermione had stayed up 2 hours the previous night going through every dark magic reference she could find, cross-referencing Hogwarts' restricted section with what she remembered of the theory, and had eventually explained it to him in the measured, slightly too careful voice she used when the information was bad, and she was trying to give it to him without it being quite as bad as it was. He understood what a Horcrux was now. He understood what it meant. What he kept circling back to wasn't the concept. It was the number. Because if there were 8 pieces of Voldemort's soul anchored in his scar, and Voldemort had been making Horcruxes, had been splitting himself apart, piece by piece, over decades, then there was a question that had no comfortable answer. The question was, when did Dumbledore figure it out? Not if. Harry was past if. Nettlefang's instruments had found this in a single afternoon with equipment that had clearly been calibrated for exactly this kind of detection. Dumbledore had access to resources that made a Gringotts healer's instrument case look like a first-year starter kit. Dumbledore had been studying dark magic for the better part of a century. Dumbledore had known about the night in Godric's Hollow in more detail than he'd ever shared, had known about the curse's rebound, had known about the scar. The question wasn't if he knew. The question was what he'd planned to do about it. And the related question, the one that sat at the bottom of Harry's chest like something cold and heavy, was whether what he'd planned to do about it involved Harry surviving. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stared at the orange-black of his eyelids. The thing was, he'd always had a sense, not a thought, not a formed idea, but a sense, that there was an ending to his story that Dumbledore could see and he couldn't. That the old man's sadness when he looked at Harry wasn't just the weight of war or the grief of a mentor who'd known Harry's parents. That it was something more specific. The sadness of someone who knew the shape of a story and had already made their peace with its ending while the main character was still cheerfully unaware of it. Harry had never let himself think that thought all the way through. Nettlefang had thought it for him. He rolled over and looked at the dark red curtain an inch from his nose and thought, 8 pieces of his soul in my scar, and I've been Dumbledore's project since I was 11 months old. Then he thought, I'm angry. He sat with that for a moment, because it surprised him a little, not the anger itself, which had been a familiar companion since he was about 11, but the particular quality of it. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger that had shattered Dumbledore's instruments in 5th year when he'd been told about the prophecy. It wasn't the desperate, formless anger of someone who doesn't know where to put it. It was something quieter and steadier and more directional, like a compass settling toward north. He wanted answers. Not the kind Dumbledore gave, the kind that arrived wrapped in explanations about the greater good and the necessity of certain things and the burden of knowing too much too soon. He wanted answers that didn't come with conditions attached. He thought of Nettlefang's face in the candlelight, writing in her angular script, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sense that someone was on his side purely because the evidence said they should be. He found Hermione in the library at 9 the next morning, surrounded by books. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the particular collection she'd assembled, 7 books in a semicircle around her, all pulled from different sections, with bits of parchment tucked between their pages and a running list of notes on a separate sheet that she quickly flipped over when he sat down. Then, apparently realizing this was Harry and the time for keeping things neatly organized was past, she flipped it back. I've been researching the Accords, she said without preamble. Good morning to you too. Good morning, sit down, I've been researching the Accords. She pushed one of the books toward him, a thick volume titled International Magical Health Law, a practitioner's reference, open to a page dense with legal text. The Magical Health and Artifact Containment Accords were signed in 1847 and revised in 1994 at the International Confederation meeting. They cover any case where a living sentient magical being is found to be carrying Horcrux-class dark magic, its very specific language, Harry, Horcrux-class, which means her instruments have a formal legal definition for what they found. It's not just her opinion. Right, Harry said. Under Article 9, which is the negligence provision, any individual who held documented knowledge of the affected person's situation and occupied a formal position of care or protection is considered legally obligated to have sought specialist assessment. The standard is not did they know for certain, it's did they have sufficient information to raise the question. And Dumbledore, she stopped. Took a breath. He knew about the curse. He knew about the rebound. He's studied dark magic for decades. He had more than sufficient information to raise the question. So Nettlefang was right. Nettlefang is completely right. Something moved across Hermione's face. She'd had the same sleepless quality he had, the same slightly over-focused energy of someone who'd been thinking very hard for many hours. Harry, I need to say something. Okay. I've been defending him. Not just to you, to myself. For years. Every time something felt wrong, every time you pushed back on something he said or decided, I always found a reason why he probably had a good reason. She looked at the book in front of her. I think I made it easier for him. By being like that. I think, I'm one of the people who kept you from asking the right questions, because I was so convinced that if Dumbledore was doing something it must be right, that I talked you out of pushing harder. Harry looked at her. Hermione, I'm not asking you to absolve me, she said firmly. I'm telling you because I think you should know, and because I'm not going to do it anymore. He was quiet for a moment. You also saved my life about 15 times, he said. So. That doesn't cancel the other thing out. No, he agreed. But it's also true. She looked at him, and something in her expression relaxed very slightly from the braced, accountable set it had been in. What are you going to do? Nettlefang said don't talk to Dumbledore until the filing's in. Which is, today, probably. She said she'd file yesterday. He paused. After that, I think I want to talk to Sirius. Hermione looked up sharply. He's supposed to stay hidden. I know where he is. And this, Harry gestured vaguely at himself, at the space above his forehead. He should know. He's my godfather. He should know. Hermione considered this, then nodded once. After we hear from Nettlefang. The owl arrived at lunch. Not a Hogwarts owl, it came in through a window in the Ollery and found Harry with the directional confidence of a bird that had been given very specific instructions. It was a sleek gray thing he'd never seen before, and it landed on the table in front of him, ignoring his food and the stares of nearby students, and presented its leg with the brisk efficiency of a Gringotts courier animal, which was exactly what it was. The note was short. Filing confirmed. Emergency Containment Review Team dispatched, arrival Tuesday. Tribunal notification delivered to Wisengamot Oversight Committee this morning. They will attempt to delay. We will not allow them to. You will receive formal notification of proceedings within 72 hours. In the meantime, the formal protection status under Article 7 of the Accords is now active. This means that no individual, regardless of their position or authority, may make strategic decisions that materially affect your physical safety without your informed consent and formal Gringotts oversight. If anyone attempts to do so, contact the division immediately. The specialist team will want to speak with you on Tuesday. N. Ashgrip, Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his pocket, and looked up at Hermione across the table. It's filed, he said. Hermione released a breath she'd been holding since roughly Friday afternoon. Okay, she said. Okay. So now I write to Sirius. Ron, to his credit, had waited until Sunday morning before cornering Harry in the common room and saying, "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Harry told him. Ron's face went through several distinct stages during the telling, first skepticism, then concern, then a particular kind of focused fury that his face didn't do very often but that meant he'd arrived at something and was going to stay there. When Harry finished, Ron was quiet for a moment. 8, he said. 8. In your scar. In my scar. Ron sat back in his chair and stared at the fire. And Dumbledore, probably knew. Or knew enough. Ron's jaw tightened. He had 3 older brothers who worked in highly dangerous professions and a father who spent his career in a ministry department that was constantly underfunded and undervalued, which meant he had a very specific, practical understanding of the way institutions failed people. He didn't dress it up in philosophical terms the way Hermione did. He just knew, bone deep, what it looked like when someone in authority decided that certain information was more useful managed than shared. Right, he said. What do we do? Nettlefang's handling the legal side. There's a specialist team coming Tuesday to assess whether the fragments can be extracted. Harry said the word fragments with a slight pause around it, the way you say a word that you've decided you're going to use plainly even though every instinct says to find something softer. And there's going to be a tribunal. For Dumbledore. Yeah. Ron was quiet for another moment, watching the fire. Your mom and dad would have lost their minds over this, he said. Harry looked at him. I mean, Ron seemed to realize this could land badly and barreled forward with the particular momentum of someone who said a thing and has to either finish it or abandon it mid-sentence. They trusted him. They went into hiding because he told them to. They used the Fidelius because he recommended it. And he stopped. He knew about you all along and he didn't, Ron. Sorry. No. Harry looked at the fire. You're right. Yeah. The fire crackled. Outside the common room windows, the October sky was doing something complicated with clouds and thin sunlight. I'm coming to the tribunal, Ron said. Whatever that is, wherever it happens. I'm there. You might not be allowed. Then I'll stand outside the door. He crossed his arms in the way that meant the conversation about this was finished. I'm there. The specialist team arrived Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and they were not what Harry had expected. He'd expected, he wasn't sure. More goblins with instruments, perhaps. More of the calm, clinical efficiency that Nettlefang had brought to the examination. What arrived instead was 4 beings, 2 goblins, and 2 individuals who were neither goblin nor wizard, who moved with a particular quality of presence that made the air around them feel faintly different. Nettlefang was with them. She'd arrived an hour early, spoken briefly with McGonagall, and was waiting in the same partitioned corner of the Great Hall when Harry, Hermione, and Ron were escorted down by a very tight-faced Professor Flitwick who'd clearly been given minimal information and was managing his curiosity with visible effort. Mr. Potter, Nettlefang said. She looked exactly as she had on Friday, composed, unhurried, dark eyes moving over the 3 of them with the same clinical assessment. These are my colleagues. Senior Specialist Goldthorn, one of the goblins, older than Nettlefang by the look of him, with deep-set eyes and an expression of profound professional concentration. Junior Specialist Flint, the younger goblin, female, carrying a case of instruments that made Nettlefang's look compact. And these 2 are consultants from the International Dark Arts Containment Registry. The 2 non-goblin beings, Harry was still not quite sure what they were. There was something about their proportion that was different from both human and goblin, something older, nodded without offering names. They don't share names in professional contexts, Nettlefang said, answering Harry's unasked question. It's a professional convention. Don't take it personally. Right, Harry said. We're going to conduct the extended assessment today, Nettlefang said. It will take approximately 3 hours. It will not hurt, but some parts of it will feel strange. If at any point you want to stop, you say so and we stop. She looked at him steadily. You're in charge of this assessment, Mr. Potter. You're not a subject. You're a patient. There's a difference. Something about the way she said it, so flat and factual, as if the concept that he should have agency over what happened to his own body was so obvious it barely warranted stating, made his throat feel tight in a way he hadn't expected. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." Hermione and Ron sat against the far wall, outside the primary assessment area, close enough to be present, far enough to be out of the way. Harry sat in the examination chair that the specialists had set up, proper chair now, padded, something that acknowledged that the person sitting in it was a person. The 3 hours were, as Nettlefang had said, strange rather than painful. The instruments the specialists used worked in layers, cycling through different detection modes, building up a picture of what was in his scar the way you might build up a picture of something buried underground through successive passes of different tools. He felt warmth, and a faint pressure, and once a brief sensation like someone pressing a cold coin against the inside of his forehead from the wrong direction, which made him say "That's weird" and Goldthorn say "Yes, that is the extraction probe." It is always somewhat disorienting in a tone that suggested disorienting was significantly understated, but the professional convention was to leave it at that. During a break in the second hour, when the junior specialist was recalibrating her instruments and the registry consultants were speaking quietly to each other in a language Harry didn't recognize, Nettlefang came and sat beside him. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not the way Madame Pomfrey asked it, not medically, not with the implication that the correct answer was fine, but with actual interest in the actual answer. "I'm okay," he said. Then, more honestly, it's strange. Sitting here, knowing it's in there. I keep waiting to feel different. Like I should be able to feel it. Most people can't detect Horcrux presence from inside," she said. "The soul fragment doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. Influences, perhaps. The connection to Voldemort through the scar, that's the fragment functioning as a conduit. You've been feeling its effects for years without knowing that's what they were. The visions. Yes. The emotional transference. The pain when he's near." She paused. "The particular quality of your scar's pain when he's angry, that's not a passive magical residue. That's an active soul fragment reacting to the emotional state of its source." Harry thought about that. So when he was happy, would I feel happy? Possibly. Have you ever felt a sudden positive emotion you couldn't account for? He thought about it. Maybe. It's hard to know which feelings are mine. Nettlefang looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not pity, nothing as soft as that, but something that acknowledged the genuine strangeness of what he just said without either flinching from it or making it into a performance. "It will be clearer," she said, "when they're gone." "Can they be removed?" That's what Goldthorn's been looking for. Yes. The short answer is, we think so. The longer answer is that the extraction methodology for multiple simultaneous anchors in living tissue is not well established because no one has ever done it before, because no one has ever survived carrying this many. She said this plainly, the way she said everything, without dressing it up. You have survived because you are extraordinary, and also because the fragments have been in a stable equilibrium with your own magic for long enough that they've become familiar to each other. Which is horrifying from a dark arts containment perspective, but it means the extraction has a foundation of stability to work from. How likely is it to work? Goldthorn puts it at 73%. And the other 27? Various outcomes of varying severity. She held his gaze. I want you to know those odds before the formal consultation, not during it. Harry looked at her. 73 is better than what I thought my odds were a week ago, he said. Nettlefang was quiet for a moment. What did you think your odds were a week ago? He shrugged one shoulder. I figured I had to die at the end of it. In some form. To destroy the last piece of him. He said it with the same flat steadiness he'd found in the middle of the night, the directional anger that had settled into something clearer. Dumbledore never quite said it, but I think he believed that too. Nettlefang looked at him for a long, measured moment. Then it's good, she said, that Dumbledore is not the one in charge of this anymore. The consultation at the end of the 3 hours was delivered by Goldthorne in the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been delivering complex medical assessments for longer than most people had been alive. He confirmed the 8 anchor points. He explained, in terms Harry had specifically requested be plain rather than technical, what the extraction procedure would involve. He gave the 73% odds, confirmed Nettlefang's characterization of the stability foundation, and outlined a preliminary timeline. Harry listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, and when Goldthorne finished, he said, "When can we do it?" Goldthorne looked at Nettlefang. "After the tribunal," she said. "The extraction should not take place while the legal proceedings are active. It could complicate the evidentiary status of the findings." She looked at Harry. 2-3 weeks at most. Then we proceed. 2 or 3 weeks, Harry repeated. Steady. Acceptable. Okay. Hermione, from her spot against the wall, had been writing notes so fast that her quill had gone through 2 sheets of parchment and started on a 3rd. Ron had not written anything. He'd sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes on Harry's face for almost the entire 3 hours, with the particular, steadfast attention of someone who has decided their only job is to be present and is doing that job with everything they have. When the specialists began packing their instruments, Harry walked over and sat beside Ron. "Well," Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. 73%. Better than expected. Ron looked at him sideways. "You're being really calm." "I know. It's kind of worrying." "I know that too." Harry leaned his head back against the stone wall. "I wrote to Sirius last night. He should get it tomorrow." "What did you tell him?" "Everything." Harry closed his eyes. "He's going to be furious." Ron considered this. "Good," he said. "Honestly. Good." The formal notification arrived from the Wiesengomot Oversight Committee on Wednesday, exactly 72 hours after the filing, which told Nettlefang, when she reviewed the timestamp, that they'd delayed as long as the Accords legally permitted them to before complying. It came as a sealed document, formal and deeply unhappy in its phrasing, the language of an institution being forced to do something it would very much prefer not to do while maintaining the fiction that this was all perfectly routine. It named the case. It cited the relevant articles. It set a preliminary hearing date for 10 days' time. And it named Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore as the primary respondent. Harry held the notification in his hands for a moment. His scar wasn't hurting. It had been unusually quiet since Tuesday's assessment, as if the specialist team's instruments had temporarily disrupted whatever channel ran between him and Voldemort. The quiet felt strange. Almost peaceful, in a way that he didn't quite trust yet. He folded the notification, put it with Nettlefang's note in the inner pocket of his robes, and went to dinner. Dumbledore was at the high table, as he always was, his white beard and half-moon glasses and air of benevolent ancient wisdom exactly as they had always been. He looked down the hall at one point during the meal and his eyes found Harry's in the way they sometimes did, that particular look, the one that Harry had always interpreted as affectionate and regretful and knowing all at once, the look of a man who saw more than he said. Harry held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. There was no anger in it, or rather, the anger was there, but underneath it something had settled, some weight that had been pressing down from above had shifted. He understood now what the look meant. He understood what Dumbledore had been seeing and not saying, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that understanding it was not the same as forgiving it. The notification sat in his pocket all through dinner, solid and factual and completely without sentiment. Across the table, Hermione was talking to Ron about something in a low voice, their heads slightly together, and Harry watched them without listening, feeling the warm, specific weight of having people around him who were angry on his behalf and would be there for what came next. Outside the high windows, the October night had come in early and thick, the kind of dark that felt like it had substance, that pressed against the glass. Somewhere in London, in the fourth sub-level of a bank that smelled of stone and old parchment, Brasswick Thorne was reviewing documentation. Somewhere outside Britain, in whatever hiding place Sirius had found himself in, a grey courier owl was arriving. Somewhere in this building, Albus Dumbledore was finishing his dinner with the untroubled ease of a man who did not yet know that his name was on a formal tribunal notification, that his choices had been documented and weighed and found legally wanting, that the quiet, careful, century-long architecture of his authority was about to be examined in a courtroom by people who did not love him. Harry ate his dinner. The notification sat in his pocket. Everything was about to change, and for the first time in a very long time, Harry Potter was not waiting for someone else to decide what came next. Chapter 3. The summons. The letter reached Sirius on a Thursday morning, delivered not by a grey Gringotts owl but by Hedwig, because Harry had decided that some things deserved his own owl, his own handwriting, the particular weight of a letter written by someone who knew you and was trusting you with something real. Sirius read it in a small, cold safe-house in the Scottish Highlands, sitting at a table with a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago and a copy of the Daily Prophet he hadn't opened. He read it once quickly, the way you read something when the first line has already told you it's bad. Then he read it again slowly, the way you read something when you need to make sure you understood it correctly the first time and are hoping, in some animal way, that you didn't. He set it down. He picked it up again. He read the line about 8 anchor points for the third time, and then he stood up abruptly and walked to the window and stood there with both hands pressed flat against the cold glass, looking out at nothing, grey sky, grey hills, the particular Scottish emptiness that had no interest in anyone's interior state. After a while he said, very quietly, James. Not calling for anyone. Just saying the name the way you say a name when you need something to be witnessed by someone who isn't there. He stayed at the window for about 10 minutes. Then he went back to the table, sat down, and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Harry, and it said, I'm coming. The second was to Dumbledore, and it said considerably more than that, in language that was neither diplomatic nor carefully worded and that Sirius didn't bother rereading before he sealed it. He sent both. Then he transformed into Padfoot and stayed that way for 2 hours, lying on the stone floor with his head on his paws, because sometimes the dog could hold things that the man couldn't. Dumbledore received Sirius's letter on Friday morning. He read it at his desk while Fawkes sat on his perch and made a low sound that wasn't quite music, the sound the phoenix made when the air around Dumbledore changed quality. Dumbledore read the letter, then set it precisely in the center of his desk blotter and sat with his hands folded and looked at it. He had known, from the moment McGonagall told him about the Gringotts audit, that something like this was possible. He was not a foolish man, and the Accords were public record to anyone who looked for them, and Nettlefang Ashgrip had the documented reputation, in Gringotts' internal practitioner files, of being exactly the kind of person who would look for them. He had spent the week since the audit in the particular state of a chess player who has watched the board develop in a direction they anticipated but hoped would not materialize, not panicked, not unprepared, but aware that the game had entered a phase where the strategies that had worked for 15 years were going to be tested by a different kind of opponent. The formal tribunal notification had arrived the previous evening, hand-delivered by a Gringotts courier who had required his signature on 3 separate receipt forms and had not made eye contact throughout. Dumbledore had signed all 3 forms. He had not slept well. This was not a new state for Albus Dumbledore, who had not slept well in a reliable way since 1945, but last night had been different, not the restlessness of an active mind working on problems, but the stillness of a man sitting with the particular weight of being seen. Of having the thing you knew and carried alone suddenly illuminated from outside, made visible, documented. He was not, he told himself, ashamed of the choices he had made. He had made them with full understanding of what they were, for reasons he still believed were sound. The greater good was not a comfortable thing to serve. It required choices that a smaller goodness couldn't accommodate. But sitting alone with a thing and being required to defend it in a room full of people who had never had to make those choices were, he was discovering, quite different experiences. He picked up a fresh piece of parchment and began to write his response to the tribunal notification. Harry didn't see Dumbledore until the following Monday, which was long enough that the encounter had built up a kind of pressure in his chest that he'd been managing by not thinking about it directly, the way you don't look directly at something very bright. It happened in the corridor outside the Transfiguration classroom after lunch. Dumbledore was simply there, coming from the direction of the gargoyle that guarded his office, moving with his usual unhurried grace through the stream of students who parted around him automatically, the sea-splitting effect that authority had in school corridors. He stopped when he saw Harry. Harry stopped too. The corridor around them kept moving, students flowing past, conversations, someone's bag strap coming loose and spilling books, all the ordinary noise of a Monday afternoon, and in the middle of all that ordinary noise, the two of them looked at each other. Dumbledore's face was complicated. It was the face Harry had always known, the pale blue eyes and the long silver beard and the expression of someone who had lived long enough to find most things both sadder and more interesting than other people did. But there was something different in it now. Something that had shifted in the geometry of how he looked at Harry, some adjustment that was too subtle to name but that Harry felt in the way you feel when the furniture in a room you know very well has been moved by an inch. "Harry," he said. "Professor," Harry said. A pause. In the middle of a Monday corridor, surrounded by people who had no idea what was happening. "I wonder if you might come to my office this evening," Dumbledore said. "After dinner. There are things I'd like to discuss." Harry looked at him. Something in the old man's eyes was asking something that the formal sentence wasn't, asking for the conversation, asking for the space to explain, asking in the particular way of someone who knows the window for that kind of asking is closing. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," Harry said. "Not until after the tribunal." The words came out steadier than he'd expected. Not cold, he didn't feel cold toward Dumbledore, exactly, which surprised him. He felt the anger, the directed anger that had been his companion since Friday, but underneath it something more like grief, the grief of finding out that someone you loved had been making decisions about your life that you didn't know about and hadn't consented to. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The blue eyes didn't flinch. "You have every right to feel, I know I do," Harry said. "That's not," he stopped. Started again. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Professor. I'm just being honest. It's better if we do this properly." Something moved across Dumbledore's face that Harry had never seen there before and couldn't quite name. It was gone in a moment. "Of course," he said. "You're right." He moved on down the corridor. Harry stood for a second, then walked the other way, and didn't realize until he was around the corner and out of sight that his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, just from the spent energy of holding himself together through something that mattered. He pressed them flat against the cool stone wall and breathed for a moment. Then Ron appeared around the corner and said, "Did you just?" "Yeah." "How did it go?" "Fine." Harry pushed off the wall. "I held it together." Ron looked at him sideways. "You're allowed to not hold it together sometimes." "I know," Harry said. "I will. Later." Ron seemed to accept this as a reasonable timeline and fell into step beside him. "Nettlefang sent a message through the school Olary this morning. Didn't know she knew how to use it." "What did she say?" "Sirius is coming Saturday. She's arranged for him to come to the Gringotts division office for a formal consultation. It's neutral ground," she said, "and safer than him traveling openly." Ron paused. "She also said to tell you that the tribunal date is confirmed. A week from Thursday." Harry absorbed this. "That's soon." "Yeah." Ron was quiet for a beat. "Are you ready?" Harry thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I think I need to see Sirius first." Saturday came with cold clear light and the smell of frost. The Gringotts division office was not, it turned out, in Diagon Alley. It was through an unmarked door on a side street off Charing Cross Road that Harry would have walked past 100 times without noticing, down a short corridor, through a space that felt like it existed slightly outside the normal geography of London, not quite underground, not quite indoors, lit by the same flat white light as the division's office and the bank itself. Nettlefang was there, and Brasswick Thorn, and a witch Harry didn't recognize who turned out to be a ministry liaison named Edwina Fitch, who had the harassed, determined look of someone navigating several competing institutional pressures at once. There was also a solicitor, a goblin solicitor, which Harry hadn't known was a thing, a trim individual named Hookwhistle who had very small glasses and a briefcase that seemed architecturally too large for its owner. And Sirius. Sirius was standing at the far end of the room with his back to the door when Harry came in, looking at a map of something on the wall that he wasn't really looking at. He turned when he heard the door, and Harry had a moment to register how he looked, thinner than the last time Harry had seen him in person, lines around his eyes that weren't entirely from age, a quality of coiled tension in his frame that spoke of months of enforced stillness. Before Sirius crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled Harry into a hug with the straightforward force of someone who had been waiting to do exactly that since Thursday morning. Harry hugged him back. He hadn't expected how much he needed it. They stood like that for a moment, and nobody in the room said anything, which Harry appreciated more than he could have articulated. When Sirius pulled back, his hands were on Harry's shoulders and he was looking at his face with the particular attention of someone conducting a rapid damage assessment. "You're okay?" he said. "I'm okay." "You're sure?" "Sirius." "Right." He didn't let go of Harry's shoulders. "8, he said. The word came out with a particular compressed force, like it had been held under pressure since Thursday. 8, Harry. I know. The absolute, he stopped. Looked around the room, seemed to remember they had an audience. Made a visible effort to convert what he wanted to say into something that fit the room. Mostly succeeded. "I have things I want to say about Dumbledore," he said, with restrained precision, "that I'm going to save for the tribunal." "That's probably wise," Brasswick said, without looking up from his documents. Sirius released Harry's shoulders and turned to face the room properly. He had, Harry noticed, a kind of presence in professional spaces that he sometimes forgot. Sirius Black had been raised in one of the oldest and most politically connected families in Wizarding Britain, and whatever that upbringing had cost him, it had given him an instinctive facility with rooms full of important people and competing agendas. He looked at Nettlefang. "You're the one who found it," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, and it came out with a simplicity and directness that had nothing ceremonial about it. He meant it entirely, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he meant it. Nettlefang looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "We have a lot to cover." The consultation lasted 3 hours. Hookwhistle the Goblin solicitor laid out the tribunal structure with the crisp efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case and had prepared for it thoroughly. The tribunal would be presided over by a panel of 5, drawn from the Wisengamot Oversight Committee, not the full Wisengamot, which would have been too subject to political pressure, but the oversight body, which operated under different accountability structures. The chair of the panel was Amelia Bones, which made Sirius's expression shift into something more settled when her name was mentioned. "She's fair," he said. "She has a reputation for it," Hookwhistle confirmed. "More importantly, she has a professional history of not being particularly impressed by either fame or institutional authority." He adjusted his small glasses. "She is, however, very impressed by evidence. Which is fortunate, because the evidence in this case is thorough." Nettlefang walked through the findings again, not for Harry's benefit, but for Sirius's, and for the record. 8 anchor points. The Horcrux class density. The chain of documented knowledge. The Article 9 negligence standard. Sirius listened to all of it without interrupting, which cost him something visibly but which he managed. When Nettlefang finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He knew," Sirius said finally. "Didn't he? Dumbledore. He knew what was in the scar." "We cannot say what Dumbledore knew with certainty," Hookwhistle said carefully. What we can establish is what he should have investigated, given what was in his possession. That's a legal distinction, Sirius said. I'm asking you, people who've spent 30 years studying this, whether a man of his knowledge and experience could have had access to everything you've just described and not known. A pause. No, Nettlefang said. He could not have. Sirius nodded once, tightly. Right. He looked at Harry. I'm sorry, he said. For not pushing harder. For not asking more questions when I had you in front of me. Harry shook his head. You were in Azkaban for 12 years. You didn't. I had 2 years after Azkaban, Sirius said. I had opportunities. I trusted him too. He said it with the flatness of a man giving evidence against himself. I'm not asking for absolution, just, I'm sorry. For what it's worth. It's worth a lot, Harry said. Edwina Fitch, the ministry liaison, had been largely quiet through the consultation, making notes and occasionally exchanging glances with Hookwhistle in a way that suggested a pre-existing professional understanding. Now she spoke for the first time in an hour. I need to be transparent about the ministry's position, she said, which I am not, personally, endorsing, but which I am professionally obligated to convey. Everyone looked at her. The minister has been briefed on the tribunal. His concern is primarily about public perception, specifically, about what a formal finding against Dumbledore does to public confidence in the institutions that have been running the war effort. She said this with the careful neutrality of someone laying down a live wire. There is pressure within the ministry to characterize the tribunal as a Gringotts overreach. To suggest that the accords don't apply in cases involving active threats to national security. That's not a legal argument, Hookwhistle said immediately. It's not even a coherent one. The accords predate every relevant piece of ministry legislation. I'm aware, Fitch said. I'm telling you what the pressure is, not what the law is. Sirius looked at her. You came here to warn us. I came here as a liaison, she said, precisely. What you interpret that as is your business. Sirius studied her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. All right, he said. Thank you. Brasswick Thorn, who had been reading documents throughout, looked up. The ministry's characterization of the accords is irrelevant to the tribunal process, he said. The panel is independent of ministry oversight. That's explicit in the treaty language. He looked at Harry. What the ministry can do is create noise. Confuse the public narrative. Make this feel like an attack rather than a legal proceeding. He met Harry's eyes. Which means it matters, how you're seen. Not by the tribunal, they have the evidence, but by the public. I'm not interested in being a symbol, Harry said. I've been a symbol my whole life. I'm interested in the truth being documented. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Nettlefang said. But Brasswick is right that the narrative matters. The ministry will try to make this about political motivations. The counter to that is your face, your words, your willingness to speak plainly about what happened. Harry thought about this. Will I testify? You can, Hookwhistle said. You're not required to. But your testimony would be, he searched for the word. Definitive. In terms of the negligence finding. The clinical evidence establishes the magical facts. Your testimony establishes the human ones. The human ones, Harry repeated. Whether you were told. What you were told. What was kept from you. Hookwhistle's small eyes were steady behind the small glasses. The legal standard requires us to prove that Dumbledore had sufficient information and failed to act. Your testimony speaks to whether he had sufficient information about you, your experiences, your understanding of your own situation, and chose not to share what he knew. Harry sat with that for a moment. Sirius was looking at him, not pushing, not suggesting, just present. I'll testify, Harry said. They ate lunch together afterward, a strange, makeshift thing, sandwiches from a tray that appeared to have been provided by someone's assistant, gathered around the consultation table while the official meeting dissolved into something more human. Sirius sat next to Harry and ate his sandwich and periodically looked at Harry with the slightly desperate attentiveness of someone who wants to protect a person from something that has already happened. "Tell me about Nettlefang," Sirius said quietly, while the others were talking. "What about her? What's she like? Beyond the professional, I mean as a person." Harry considered it. "She doesn't lie," he said. "Even when the truth is awful. She just says it. And she told me I was in charge. At the assessment. She specifically said I wasn't a subject, I was a patient, and that there was a difference." He paused. "Nobody's said that to me before. About my own situation." Sirius was very still. "James would have loved her," he said. "And hated the reason she was necessary." "Yeah," Harry said. "That sounds right." Hermione and Ron arrived halfway through lunch, having spent the morning in Diagon Alley with Mrs. Weasley under the pretense of a supply run, and the room became louder and more crowded and Sirius's face did something complicated when he saw Ron that was clearly about the Weasleys and what they represented and all the ways that family had been his family too, once, before everything. Ron shook his hand, formal and slightly awkward. Sirius looked at him for a second, then clapped him on the shoulder with enough warmth that Ron's awkwardness dissolved. "Your mother wrote me," Sirius said. "She's furious." "About Dumbledore?" Ron said. "About Harry." Sirius's expression shifted. "About the fact that her kids have been at this school, in this situation, and the people responsible didn't," he stopped. "She's going to write to the tribunal, apparently. As a parent of students. Hook Whistle says that's admissible." "Mum writing to the tribunal," Ron said slowly, and a grin appeared on his face despite everything. "Merlin. Dumbledore's really in for it." Monday brought a different kind of problem. The Daily Prophet had the story. Harry wasn't sure how. He suspected the Ministry, or someone close to the Ministry, had leaked something, because the version the Prophet had was just distorted enough to be clearly sourced from someone who had the broad outlines but not the specifics. The headline read, "Gringotts challenges Hogwarts authority, sources suggest audit, overreach, in Potter case." The article was 3 columns, quoted unnamed ministry officials who called the tribunal proceedings a distressing example of Goblin institutions interfering in wizarding affairs, and described the accords as obscure international technicalities. It did not mention the 8 anchor points. It did not mention Horcruxes. It did not mention Dumbledore's name, though it danced around it with transparent delicacy. Harry read it at breakfast. Then he set the paper down and looked at Hermione. "The Ministry," she said. "Obviously." He pushed his eggs around. "They're going to make this about goblins versus wizards. It's a deflection strategy," she said. "If they can make people focus on whether Gringotts has the right to do this, nobody asks what Gringotts found." Ron tore the front page off his copy of The Prophet and folded it into an airplane. "Should I send this back to them?" Ron asking. "Let them run it," Harry said. "Let them say whatever they want about overreach. Because when Nettlefang stands up at that tribunal and reads her findings out loud, in front of witnesses, with Amelia Bones in the chair, he thought of the detection disc, of 8 points of reddish light. Nobody's going to be talking about institutional jurisdiction after that." Hermione looked at him with an expression he'd seen only a few times, the expression she wore when someone said something so precisely correct that it briefly overrode her compulsion to add to it. She just nodded. Down the hall, at the teacher's table, Snape was eating breakfast with the aggressive self-containment he brought to most human activities. His eyes moved down the hall periodically in Harry's direction with an expression that was harder to read than usual, not the habitual cold antagonism, but something more calculating. More attentive. Harry had been aware of Snape's attentiveness since the audit. Something had shifted in the potions master since Friday, some angle of his awareness that had tilted toward Harry and the events unfolding around him. It wasn't concern, exactly. It was more like someone watching a game they had a stake in that they hadn't acknowledged having. Harry filed this away and went back to his eggs. The summons came to Dumbledore officially on Tuesday. It came by Gringotts' courier, the same grey courier bird that had delivered Nettlefang's note to Harry, landing on the high table at breakfast in front of Dumbledore with the calm authority of a bird that didn't need permission to be anywhere. Every head at the student tables turned. Every teacher at the high table went very still. Dumbledore took the envelope with the same unhurried ease with which he did everything. He broke the seal, unfolded the document, and read it in the time it took the hall to hold its collective breath. Then he set it beside his plate, picked up his fork, and continued eating. Which was, Harry had to admit, an extraordinary piece of theatre. McGonagall's hand was tight on her teacup. Flitwick was staring fixedly at his porridge. Sprout looked like she was doing controlled breathing. Snape was perfectly still, watching Dumbledore with the flat attention of a cat watching something it has not yet decided how to react to. At the student tables, the whispers were already starting. Harry ate his breakfast. He was aware of people looking at him, of the connection everyone was making or trying to make, of the gossip machinery of Hogwarts engaging with all its considerable horsepower. He ignored it and ate his toast, and beside him, Ron ate his sausages, and Hermione pretended to read but was watching the high table, and the morning moved forward. After breakfast, walking out of the great hall, Harry passed close enough to the high table that he and Dumbledore were briefly adjacent, maybe 6 feet of space between them, the old man still sitting, Harry moving toward the doors with the rest of the crowd. Their eyes met again. Dumbledore looked at him with the complicated expression Harry had seen in the corridor, but there was something added to it now. Something Harry needed a moment to identify. It was, he realized, a kind of relief. As if some long-maintained architecture inside Dumbledore had been waiting for a door it had to open, and the summons was the key. Or maybe Harry was projecting. He moved through the doors and out into the cold October morning, the air sharp in his lungs, the castle at his back, the castle that had been home and trap and the sight of more things than he could count. Behind him, Dumbledore sat at the high table with the tribunal summons beside his plate and his breakfast cooling in front of him and the weight of everything he knew, everything he'd decided, everything he'd kept, pressing down through decades into this particular Tuesday morning. The game had changed. Not ended. Voldemort was still out there, still gathering, still building towards something that Harry was still somehow in the middle of. The Horcruxes still existed, the fragments still needed destroying, the war still had its terrible forward momentum. None of that had changed. But the terms had changed. The shape of what Harry owed and what he was owed had changed. And somewhere in the 4th sublevel of a bank in London, a goblin archivist was reviewing final documentation while a goblin healer was preparing testimony that would be heard by people who had the authority and the will to act on it. The summons had been delivered. Now they waited for Thursday. Chapter 4, The Trial. The tribunal convened on a Thursday morning in a room that didn't officially exist. It was on the 2nd floor of a building in Whitehall that appeared, from the outside, to be a minor government records office, the kind of building that civil servants walked past every day without registering, that had been unremarkable for so long it had achieved a kind of architectural invisibility. Inside, past a reception desk staffed by a wizard who processed paperwork for the Department of Magical Transportation and was very good at looking bored, there was a corridor that turned left twice and deposited you at a heavy wooden door with no markings on it. The room behind the door was larger than the building should have been able to contain. Stone floor, stone walls, high ceiling, lit by floating lanterns that burned a steady neutral white. 5 chairs on a raised dais at one end, currently occupied by 4 individuals and 1 empty seat. The 5 chairs faced a floor-level space where a table and 2 chairs had been arranged for the respondent and his legal representative, and opposite that, along the left wall, a longer table for the presenting party. The gallery, such as it was, consisted of 2 rows of seats along the right wall. They were full. Harry sat in the gallery between Sirius and Hermione, with Ron on Hermione's other side. Sirius had dressed formally, deep grey robes, no eccentricity, the kind of clothes that said I take this seriously without saying anything else. Harry had done the same, Hermione's doing, who had appeared at the portrait hole that morning with his best robes over her arm and a look on her face that brooked no argument. Amelia Bones took the empty chair at the center of the dais at exactly 9 in the morning and placed a folder on the table in front of her with the brisk finality of someone who intended to run this room and wanted that understood immediately. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her mid-50s with a monocle she used for reading in a manner that Harry associated, in some corner of his mind, with particularly effective teachers, the ones who never raised their voice because they never needed to. She glanced along her panel, then at the presenting table where Nettlefang sat with Hookwhistle and a stack of documents, then at the respondents' table. Dumbledore was already there. He had arrived before anyone else in the gallery, Harry noticed, already seated when they came in, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his white beard and half-moon glasses and bright blue eyes composed and present and carrying all of their usual weight. Beside him sat his legal representative, a tall wizard named Tertius Pemberton whose family had been doing complex magical law for 3 generations and who had the particular stillness of someone who had been briefed very thoroughly and was now waiting to perform. Dumbledore looked the same as he always did. That was the thing about him, he looked the same. The same ancient, warm, sorrowful wisdom, the same quality of presence that had for Harry's entire life at Hogwarts meant safety and knowledge and the particular comfort of someone being in charge who knew more than anyone else. Looking at him now, from the gallery, with the tribunal documents in his pocket and Sirius's shoulder solid against his, Harry felt the complicated grief of that again, the gap between what a person represented and what they had actually done, and the way that gap didn't make you stop feeling what you'd always felt, it just added something painful alongside it. Sirius was looking at Dumbledore too. Harry didn't look at Sirius's face. Amelia Bones said, "This tribunal is convened under Article 9 of the Magical Health and Artifact Containment Accords, revised 1994. The presenting party is Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division. The respondent is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, currently holding the positions of Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot." She said the titles with no particular emphasis, which somehow made them land more heavily than emphasis would have. The panel will hear evidence, examine witnesses, and deliver a finding. This is not a criminal proceeding. It is a negligence determination under international magical health law. Mr. Dumbledore retains all rights of response and representation, which he has exercised by retaining counsel. She looked at both tables. "Are the parties ready to proceed?" "Ready," said Hookwhistle. "Ready," said Pemberton. "Then let's begin," said Bones. Nettlefang presented her findings first, and she did it the way she did everything, without ornament, without hedging, without performing either certainty or humility. She stood at the presenting table and walked the panel through each step in the order she had conducted them, the initial standard assessment, the anomalous reading when the instrument darkened, the secondary artifact detection, the 8 anchor points registering at Horcrux class density. She described her instruments. She described the legal definitions that governed the detection methodology. She answered 3 technical questions from panel members with the precision of someone who had expected the questions and could answer them in her sleep. When Pemberton rose for cross-examination, he was methodical. He questioned her instruments' calibration, their certification, the last date they'd been independently verified. Nettlefang produced the documentation for each question before he'd finished asking it, sliding papers across the table with the rhythm of someone who has been doing this long enough to prepare for every challenge. He questioned her qualifications. She recited them with the flat brevity of someone who finds the question faintly insulting but is choosing professionalism. He questioned whether Horcrux class was a recognized legal standard or merely a descriptive term. Hookwhistle intervened on that one, citing the 1994 revision's explicit definitional language in 3 separate clauses, which Pemberton had no effective counter to. It went on for 40 minutes. At the end of it, the readings stood. The 8 anchor points stood. The legal classification stood. When Nettlefang sat down, Amelia Bones made a note on her document and said, "We'll take a brief recess before the specialist testimony." In the gallery, Sirius leaned close to Harry's ear. "She's good. She's the best person I've met," Harry said quietly, and meant it. Goldthorn took the stand after the recess and confirmed the specialist team's findings with the measured authority of someone who had been examining dark artifacts since before most of the people in the room had been born. He described the extended assessment in detail. He described the specific structure of the anchor points, the way they'd been layered, the deliberateness of the construction, the fact that the magical signature across all 8 was consistent and unified, pointing to a single caster working with extreme intentionality over a period of time. Then he said something that Nettlefang had not included in her initial filing, something that the extended assessment had revealed, and when he said it the room went very quiet. "The fragments were not all deposited simultaneously," he said. "The magical dating methodology we use, analogous, in principle, to radiocarbon dating in the non-magical world, indicates that the anchor points were established at different times. The first, and densest, corresponds in age to approximately 15 years ago. The most recent corresponds to approximately 2 years ago." A murmur in the gallery. Bones's monocle caught the light as she looked up. "2 years ago," she repeated. "The Triwizard Tournament year," Hermione breathed, barely audible, beside Harry. Harry felt it land in him with a dull, specific weight. The graveyard. The ritual. Bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. The blood of the enemy, his blood, taken for Voldemort's reconstruction. The moment when Voldemort had touched him and the scar had screamed and something had moved between them like a current. He hadn't just been used for the ritual. Something had been deposited in return. He pressed his hands flat on his knees and breathed. Sirius had gone absolutely rigid beside him. Goldthorn continued. "The addition of a soul fragment during the reconstruction ritual in the Triwizard year appears to have been deliberate. The magical structure shows the characteristic intentionality of a planned Horcrux creation. Lord Voldemort, during that ritual, used his reconstruction to simultaneously create and anchor an additional soul fragment in Mr. Potter's scar. He did it twice," Ron said, very quietly, from Hermione's other side. "Harry. He did it to you twice." Amelia Bones looked at the gallery once, briefly, and her expression was the most humanly unguarded it had been all morning, a flash of something that was close to anger, quickly contained and reprofessionalized. She looked back at Goldthorn. "Thank you," she said. "That will be all from this witness." After Goldthorn, the chain of documented knowledge. This was Horcruxes' piece, and he delivered it with the relentless, methodical precision of someone laying railroad track, one piece after another, each one connecting to the last, each one adding to a structure that was becoming unavoidable. He entered into evidence the records of every documented magical assessment Harry Potter had received since arriving at Hogwarts. The Medowitch records. The post-incident reports. The documented interactions with dark artifacts, the diary in second year, the connection to Voldemort's mind in fourth and fifth. Each report had passed through or been available to the headmaster's record system. Each one contained information that, Hookwhistle argued, should have prompted specialist assessment of the scar. Then he entered the theoretical scholarship. 3 publications by Albus Dumbledore himself, Hookwhistle said, placing them on the evidence table with the quiet satisfaction of a carpenter finishing a joint, from 1969, 1972, and 1978, discuss the magical mechanics of soul fragmentation in dark artifact creation. The 1972 publication specifically addresses the theoretical possibility of a soul fragment being inadvertently anchored in a living subject during a failed curse's rebound. He let that sit for a moment. Professor Dumbledore was, it appears, one of the foremost authorities on the magical mechanics that were, unknown to most, operating in Harry Potter's scar. For 15 years. The room was very, very quiet. Pemberton rose. My client's academic publications represent theoretical work conducted decades before the events in question. Theoretical knowledge does not what? Bones said, with a mildness that had something hard under it. Complete the sentence, counselor. Pemberton recalibrated. Theoretical knowledge does not automatically translate to clinical certainty about a specific individual case. Professor Dumbledore could not have known with certainty, the Article 9 standard, Hookwhistle said, still in the same measured tone, is not certainty. It is sufficient grounds to investigate. Those are very different thresholds. Bones nodded once and made another note. Harry testified at 11:30. He walked to the witness position, a chair set between the two tables, facing the panel, and sat down and looked at Amelia Bones and thought, tell the truth plainly and don't perform anything. Hookwhistle led him through it. He'd rehearsed with Harry twice over the preceding days, not coaching his answers but clarifying the structure of what needed to be said, the timeline, the specific incidents, the specific conversations. What he'd been told. What he hadn't been told. What he'd intuited and been allowed to keep intuiting without correction. Harry talked about the night in Godric's Hollow, what he knew of it, what Dumbledore had told him over the years, the pieces, the gaps. He talked about every time his scar had hurt and what Dumbledore's response had been. He talked about occlumency lessons, about the deliberate opening of the mental connection between him and Voldemort, about the vision in the Department of Mysteries. He talked about Cedric. He talked about the graveyard. He described the ritual without being asked to, the whole of it, the blood, the bone, the flesh, the moment Voldemort had touched his arm and his scar had gone beyond pain into something that didn't have a name. He watched the panel as he spoke and saw what it did to their faces, the careful professional stillness cracking slightly at the edges, Bones's jaw tightening, one of the other panel members looking briefly at the table as if they needed a moment. He talked about the prophecy. How he'd found out about it. When. The fact that he'd been 16 years old and in the headmaster's office, devastated by grief, before Dumbledore had told him the thing that shaped every decision that had ever been made about his life. Did Professor Dumbledore ever indicate, Hookwhistle asked, that he believed your death might be necessary for the defeat of Voldemort? Not directly, Harry said. He never said it straight out. But he prepared me for everything except surviving. Harry heard how that sounded in the air of the room, heard the truth of it, the way it was both simple and vast. Everything I learned, everything he taught me, it was about being ready to face Voldemort. Not about afterward. Not about what came next. There was no next, in the way he talked about it. And he stopped for a second. I think I knew that. I just never let myself say it, because if I said it, I had to think about what it meant. Hookwhistle nodded, once, and didn't ask anything else. Pemberton's cross-examination was careful and not unkind, which surprised Harry. He didn't attack Harry's account or suggest he was exaggerating. He focused instead on Dumbledore's care, the ways in which the headmaster had protected Harry, helped him, prepared him as well as he could for a situation that had no precedent. He asked Harry whether Dumbledore had ever deliberately harmed him. Whether he believed Dumbledore's motivations were malicious. No, Harry said. I don't think he wanted to hurt me. I think he loved me, in his way. He paused. But I also think he decided, a long time ago, probably before I was even at Hogwarts, that I was going to have to die, and that he'd rather I died not knowing it was coming. Because that way I'd be brave and willing and it would be easier. For the war. He looked at Dumbledore for the first time since sitting down. Held his gaze. I think he thought that was kindness. I think he was wrong. Dumbledore looked back at him steadily. His expression was very still and very present and did not look away. I think he was wrong, Harry said again, quieter. Not because dying would have been so terrible, but because it was my life. It was my choice to make. And he took that away from me before I was old enough to tie my shoes. He looked back at Bones. That's all I wanted to say. They broke for lunch. In a side corridor, Sirius found Harry and didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just stood with him in the cold stone quiet while the sounds of the tribunal room filtered through the heavy door. James would have, Sirius started. You keep saying that, Harry said, not unkindly. I know. Sirius looked at the wall. I keep thinking, he should be here for this. Both of them. They should be here. He pushed off the wall and turned to face Harry directly. What you said in there. About it being your life, your choice. Yeah. That was your father talking. Same stubbornness. Same, he always knew which things were worth saying clearly and which were worth saying quietly, and he always knew the difference. Sirius's voice was rough at the edges. You sounded like him. Harry absorbed this. It sat in him the way a thing does when it is both painful and necessary. Good, he said finally. I think he'd have wanted this. The tribunal. Not because it hurts Dumbledore, but because someone finally asked, Sirius said. Someone finally asked the right question about you. Yeah. Harry nodded. Because someone finally asked. The afternoon session brought Snape. He hadn't been listed as a scheduled witness, which meant Nettlefang and Hookwhistle hadn't called him. He'd come of his own volition, which made the gallery sit up when he walked in, and made Pemberton's expression do something complicated, and made Dumbledore look at him with an attention that was different from the composed stillness he'd maintained all morning. Bones looked at the unexpected witness with the focused interest of someone who has been in enough proceedings to know that unscheduled testimony is almost always the most significant kind. Severus Snape, she said. You've come to give voluntary evidence? I have, Snape said. He stood in the witness position without sitting, which was his prerogative, and he carried himself with the contained vertical tension that Harry had spent 5 years misreading as contempt for everything and was now, looking at it differently, reading as something more like a man holding himself together through long practice. Very well, Bones said. Proceed. Snape looked at the panel, and then, briefly, once, at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back. Something passed between them that had years in it, a history Harry couldn't fully read, a relationship built in the shadow of impossible choices and mutual complicity and whatever genuine affection or respect existed underneath all of that. Then Snape looked at the panel again and began. I have been aware of the theoretical basis for what Nettlefang Ashgrip found in Harry Potter's scar since 1981, he said, and the room was so quiet that his words seemed to arrive at each person individually. I became aware because Albus Dumbledore shared his suspicions with me in the winter following the attack in Godric's Hollow. He had already concluded, based on his knowledge of the Dark Lord's activities in the preceding years, that the rebound of the killing curse had created an inadvertent Horcrux, a soul fragment anchored in the scar. The room did not make a sound. He shared this with me because I was serving as his agent within Voldemort's organization and because he required my understanding of the Dark Lord's magical practices to verify his hypothesis. Snape's voice was level. Flat. It had the quality of testimony that has been thought about for a very long time and is now being delivered because the time for it has finally arrived. I confirmed his hypothesis through my access to the Dark Lord's own magical records, which I obtained over the following 3 years. By 1984, we both knew with certainty what was in the scar. By that time, Harry Potter was 4 years old. Bones set down her pen. We also knew, or believed, that the soul fragment could not be safely removed while the Dark Lord remained alive, that his destruction was prerequisite to the fragment's extraction. This was, I now understand from the specialist testimony presented today, incorrect. The extraction methodology that Goldthorne described did not exist in 1984, but it has existed, in preliminary form, since 1997, and in refined form since 2001. He paused. We were not updated on the state of extraction methodology because we did not seek to be updated. Because the working assumption, Dumbledore's assumption, which I did not challenge, was that the soul fragment and Harry Potter were, for practical purposes, inseparable until the end. The end, Bones said carefully. Harry Potter's death, Snape said. Yes. In the gallery, Harry heard Sirius make a sound. A very quiet sound. The kind of sound that comes from somewhere below speech. I want to be precise about this, Snape continued, and his voice shifted very slightly, some modulation entering it that Harry had never heard there before, not warmth, exactly, but something less armored. Dumbledore did not want Harry to die. He took no pleasure in the necessity, as he understood it. He spent 17 years ensuring that Harry was as capable as possible, as prepared as possible, for what he believed was an inevitable confrontation with an inevitable outcome. He believed he was being merciful by not telling Harry the full truth. He looked at the panel. He was wrong. And he was wrong in a way that endangered Harry's life not once but repeatedly, because every strategic decision made about Harry's safety was filtered through an assumption that his death was ultimately necessary. That assumption shaped what protection was considered adequate. That assumption shaped what risks were considered acceptable. He stopped. I should have challenged it years ago. I did not. That is my evidence, and it is also, for the record, my admission. The room was completely still. Then Bones said, very quietly, "Thank you, Professor Snape." Snape walked back to the gallery and sat down in an empty seat, and Harry watched him and Snape didn't look at Harry, kept his eyes forward, the rigid professional composure fully reassembled around whatever it had cost him to stand up and say those things. Harry would have a great many things to think about later regarding Severus Snape. For now, he just watched the tribunal. Pemberton made his closing argument in the late afternoon, and it was genuinely impressive, a careful, intelligent case for a man who had spent his life in service of a greater good that demanded sacrifices no one else had the breadth of vision to understand. He cited Dumbledore's record. He cited the impossible position of a man who had known more than anyone else about a war that everyone else was only beginning to understand. He cited the absence of malice, the presence of love, the consistent prioritization of Harry's welfare within the constraints of a situation that had no good options. It was honest, as far as it went. Harry sat and listened to it and felt the truth of parts of it alongside the insufficiency of all of it. Nettlefang's closing statement was 4 sentences long. Harry Potter has been carrying the magical equivalent of 8 Horcruxes in his scar for 15 years. Albus Dumbledore knew the cause, had theoretical knowledge of the mechanism, and had access to expert resources sufficient to investigate the question of treatment. He did not seek treatment because his strategic model required Harry Potter to die. Under Article 9 of the Accords, that constitutes a fundamental failure of the duty of care owed to a minor in his educational custody. She sat down. In the chair between the 2 tables, Dumbledore looked at the panel. He had not spoken since the proceedings opened. He had been offered the opportunity to deliver a statement and had not yet taken it. Bones looked at him now. "Professor Dumbledore. Do you wish to speak?" Dumbledore unfolded his hands from the table in front of him. He looked at Bones with the blue eyes that had seen everything, and then he looked at Harry, and then he stood up. "I would like to speak," he said, "not in my defense." He paused. But in acknowledgement. He spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't argue the findings. He didn't dispute Snape's testimony or Nettlefang's evidence or the methodology of the specialist team. He didn't invoke the greater good, though Harry half expected him to. He said that he had made choices in a war that had no clean options, and that he had believed those choices were the right ones, and that believing you are right is not the same as being right, and that the distinction, the failure to hold that distinction with enough discipline, had cost Harry years of knowledge he deserved to have. He said that he had loved Harry's parents, and that their deaths had shaped in him a determination to end Voldemort that had perhaps, in some ways he had not fully examined, taken precedence over the humanity of the person who was going to have to do it. He said that he was old, and that old men sometimes confused wisdom with certainty, and that the difference between the two was that wisdom was aware of its limits and certainty was not. He looked at Harry throughout. Not performing the look. Not using it. Just looking, the way you look at someone when you are trying to hold your own accounting honestly. I'm sorry, Harry, he said. And it landed the way that things land when they are simply true, not neatly, not with resolution, but with weight. Harry looked back at him. He held Dumbledore's gaze until the old man looked away, back to the panel, and sat down. The gallery was silent. Bones said, "The panel will deliberate. We will reconvene tomorrow morning for the finding." Outside in the cold October air, it was past 5, the light was going, the street was ordinary and indifferent around them. Harry stood on the pavement and felt Hermione take his hand and didn't pull away. "You okay?" she said. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think, yeah. I think so." Ron was standing just behind him, hands in his pockets, looking up at the unremarkable building as if he could see through the walls to the room behind them. "What he said," Ron said. "Dumbledore. At the end. Yeah. Did it help?" Harry thought about it. Thought about the 12 minutes, the look, the 2 words. "A bit," he said. "Not enough. But, a bit." Sirius had come out last, and he came to stand beside Harry and didn't say anything for a while, just looking down the street at nothing in particular. "I was so angry at him," Sirius said eventually. "For 20 years. For a lot of things that weren't actually about what I was saying I was angry about." He paused. "Today it wasn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected him to fight it. To defend himself. Explain it away." Sirius exhaled. "He didn't." "No," Harry agreed. "He didn't." They stood together on the pavement while the London evening closed around them, cold and ordinary and ongoing, and somewhere in the stone room behind them 5 people were beginning to deliberate something that had been coming for 15 years. Chapter 5, The Verdict. The panel deliberated for 19 hours. Harry knew this because he didn't sleep for most of them. He lay in his dormitory bed at Hogwarts. They'd been sent back Thursday evening with the instruction to return Friday morning for the finding, and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about Snape's testimony. The way it had landed. By 1984, we both knew with certainty what was in the scar. By that time, Harry Potter was 4 years old. 4 years old. Harry tried to place himself at 4, tried to find some memory of being 4 years old in the Dursleys' house, some image of himself small enough that the age felt real. He had almost nothing from that early. Fragments. The smell of Petunia's cleaning products. The particular quality of light through the cupboard door. He had been 4 years old, living in a cupboard, and 2 men had known what was in his scar and had decided, with the full weight of their intelligence and their strategic vision, that the information was more useful managed than shared. He rolled over. The anger was still there, that directional, compass needle anger that had settled north in the middle of that first sleepless night after Nettlefang's examination. But something had been added to it after today, some new layer that he kept turning over, trying to identify its quality. He thought it was grief. A specific, almost retrospective grief, not for himself now, 16 and functional and still here, but for all the points along the way where the truth would have mattered. 7-year-old Harry, wondering why the thing on his forehead hurt sometimes when he was near certain people. 10-year-old Harry, learning he was a wizard and having the first inkling that his history was a story someone else had been telling about him. 11, 12, every year carrying something he'd been allowed to feel but not understand, because understanding might have changed the shape of what Dumbledore needed him to become. He pressed his palm flat against his forehead, against the scar, feeling its familiar narrow ridge against his skin. 8 pieces of a monster's soul. For 15 years. And tomorrow, finally, someone was going to write it down in an official document and say, this was wrong. He fell asleep sometime after 3 and was up before 6, dressed before anyone else in the dormitory stirred. He sat on the windowsill watching the grounds go from black to gray to the pale thin gold of early November light on frost, and he let himself want the verdict the way he hadn't let himself want it yet, not just want justice in the abstract, but want the specific physical reality of a panel of 5 people looking at the evidence and saying we find. He wanted to hear those words. He wanted them to exist in the world as documented fact, indelible, unargued, part of the record that could be read by anyone who ever needed to know what had happened here. Hermione knocked on the dormitory door at 7. She had tea, 2 cups, and an expression of someone who had also not slept much but was managing it through will and preparation. "How are you?" she said. "Ready," he said. She handed him his tea and sat on the end of his bed, and they drank in silence for a while, the good kind of silence, the kind that didn't need filling. "Whatever happens today," she said eventually, "it's already real. The testimony is already on record. Snape's evidence is already on record. Goldthorn's findings. Nettlefang's findings." She turned her cup in her hands. "Even if they deliberate badly, which I don't think they will, but even if, nothing that was said yesterday goes away." "I know," Harry said. "But I want the finding." "I know you do." She paused. "I do too." They arrived back at the Whitehall building at 8:30. Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Sirius, who had not returned to the safe house but had, judging by the faint shadows under his eyes, spent the night in a state similar to Harry's. He was dressed again in the formal grey robes, his dark hair pulled back, his face set in the particular expression of someone who has steeled themselves for something over many hours and is now simply waiting to receive it. Nettlefang was already there. She was standing in the corridor outside the tribunal room with a cup of something that steamed, her instrument case at her feet, reviewing a document with the focused attention of someone doing a final check. She looked up when they came in, assessed them all with a single sweep of her dark eyes, and said, "Good morning," with the same flat equanimity she brought to everything. "How long did they deliberate?" Harry asked. "Approximately 19 hours. They sent word at 3 this morning that they had reached a finding." She folded the document. "Bones will read it at 9. Sirius looked at her. "In your professional experience, 19 hours. What does that suggest?" Nettlefang considered this. "It suggests they discussed it thoroughly," she said. "A quick deliberation on a case this complex would have worried me more." Brasswick Thorn was inside, already seated at the presenting table. He gave Nettlefang a single nod when she came in, the nod of 2 people who have spent 19 hours doing the same kind of waiting in different locations. Hookwhistle was arranging papers with the tidy compulsiveness of someone managing nerves through organization. Dumbledore was already there again. Already seated. Same position as yesterday, hands folded, composure intact, the long beard and the half-moon glasses and the particular gravity of someone who had spent a night in a different kind of reckoning than Harry's, but a reckoning nonetheless. Pemberton was beside him, but the 2 of them weren't conferring. There was nothing left to confer about. Harry sat in the gallery. Sirius sat beside him. Ron sat at the end of the row and crossed his arms and stared at the dais with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something to be right for a long time. At 9 o'clock exactly, Amelia Bones walked through the door behind the dais with her 4 colleagues and took her chair. She opened her folder. She didn't clear her throat or pause for effect or do any of the things that people did when they had a room's full attention and knew it. She simply looked at the document in front of her and began. "The panel has reached a unanimous finding," she said. The word unanimous moved through the room like a current. "On the primary question, whether the dark magical content identified in Harry Potter's scar constitutes Horcrux class contamination as defined under the 1994 revision of the Accords, the panel finds in the affirmative. The specialist testimony and primary examiner evidence are sufficient, thorough, and methodologically sound. This finding is entered into the formal record of the Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division and will be available to all relevant parties." She turned a page. On the secondary question, whether the respondent, Albus Dumbledore, occupied a position of formal care and protection over Harry Potter at the relevant times, the panel finds in the affirmative. The position of headmaster carries explicit legal obligations of care under both wizarding educational law and the Accord's Article 7 provisions. Another page. On the tertiary question, whether the respondent had access to sufficient information to be legally required to seek specialist assessment under Article 9's negligence standard, the panel finds in the affirmative. Bones's voice didn't change in register or pace, but it had a quality of absolute clarity that made each sentence feel like a fact being bolted to the floor. The respondent's own published academic work from 1969, 1972, and 1978 demonstrates familiarity with the theoretical mechanisms at issue. The witness testimony of Severus Snape establishes that the respondent had specific, direct knowledge of the soul fragment contamination from approximately 1981, confirmed to certainty by 1984. The panel finds this body of evidence decisive. She turned another page. On the central finding of negligence under Article 9, the panel finds, unanimously, that Albus Dumbledore did fail in his legal duty of care to Harry Potter by knowingly withholding information material to Harry Potter's physical safety and magical health, by failing to seek specialist assessment or treatment that was available or became available during the relevant period, and by incorporating the anticipated death of a minor in his legal care into his strategic planning for the defeat of Lord Voldemort without the knowledge or consent of that minor. In the gallery, Harry felt Sirius's hand close around his arm. Not hard, just present. The panel further finds, Bones continued, and her voice did shift now, just fractionally, just enough, that these failures resulted in Harry Potter spending 15 years in unnecessary proximity to the most dangerous category of dark magical contamination, without treatment, without informed consent, and without the ability to make decisions about his own survival. She set the page down. Looked up at the room. The finding is negligence under Article 9, sustained across all relevant counts. Unanimous. The consequences section was longer, and Bones read it with the same methodical care, but Harry heard it through a kind of haze, the way you hear things when the main thing has already happened and your mind is still processing the weight of it. Dumbledore would be required to step back from his positions of formal authority over Harry's education and welfare immediately. That meant a Hogwarts deputy, McGonagall, in practice, would take formal responsibility for Harry's well-being and educational decisions for the remainder of his time at school. His position as Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards would be formally reviewed. The Wizengamot's chief warlock position would undergo an independent performance assessment in light of the finding. He would be subject to a formal supervision order from the Gringotts Magical Health and Artifacts Division for a period of no less than 3 years, meaning that any decision he made that materially affected Harry Potter's welfare would require division notification and review. He was not removed from Hogwarts. He was not stripped of his magical license. He was not imprisoned. And Harry, listening to the consequences read out, found that he didn't want those things. He was surprised, actually, to find how clearly he didn't want them. The finding was enough. The formal record was enough. The document that now existed in Gringotts archives and would be available to any interested party, stating clearly and without sentiment what had been done and what had been withheld, was enough. What he had wanted was not Dumbledore's ruin. He had wanted the truth to be written down. Bones finished reading the consequences and set the folder flat on the table. She looked at the room once more, at Nettlefang, at Hookwhistle, at Pemberton, at Dumbledore, and then at the gallery, and for a moment her gaze rested on Harry with a directness that acknowledged him as a person rather than a subject. "The tribunal is concluded," she said. "The record will be published within 24 hours. She stood. The panel stood. They filed back through the door behind the dais, and it closed behind them, and the room became, all at once, simply a room. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Hookwhistle closed his briefcase with a soft, final click that seemed to break the spell, and noise came back into the room, quiet, controlled noise, but noise. Pemberton murmured something to Dumbledore, who shook his head slightly, a single small motion. Then Dumbledore stood. He turned and looked at the gallery, and his eyes found Harry's with the directness they always had, nothing evasive in it, never that, whatever else you could say. He held Harry's gaze for a moment, and something moved in the blue eyes that Harry couldn't fully read, too many layers deep. Then he inclined his head, a small, deliberate nod, and walked toward the door. He passed the gallery. He passed Harry's row. He paused. Harry looked up at him. From where Harry sat, Dumbledore was very tall, white-bearded, ancient, and somehow, at this moment, more ordinarily human than Harry had ever seen him, stripped of the context of Hogwarts, of the headmaster's chair and the instruments and the particular atmosphere of an office that had been arranged over decades to communicate authority and wisdom. Just a very old man who had done something wrong and knew it and had said so. "Harry," he said. Quietly. "Just that." "Professor," Harry said. A pause. Sirius, beside Harry, was absolutely still. "I hope," Dumbledore said, "that you will believe, in time, not now, perhaps, but in time, that everything I withheld was withheld out of love. Not good judgment. But love." Harry looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's part of what makes it hard." Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment. "Opened them." "Yes," he said. "It is." He looked at Harry for one more second, not asking for anything, not expecting anything, just looking, and then he walked through the door and was gone. Sirius breathed out slowly beside Harry, a long, controlled release of something that had been held under pressure for several days. "Merlin," Ron said softly, from the end of the row. "Yeah," Harry said. Outside on the pavement, the city was in full Friday morning flow, people with coffee and briefcases and the general momentum of people going places that mattered to them, all of it perfectly ordinary and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a room they'd never know existed. Harry stood in the middle of it and breathed cold air and felt, for the first time in days, the particular sensation of something being over. Not the war was nowhere near over, Voldemort was out there gathering and growing, and whatever the next stage of it was coming. But this specific thing, this specific 15-year wait, had been acknowledged and documented and found wanting by 5 people in an official capacity, and that was, he let himself feel how much that mattered, the full weight of it, didn't push it aside or contextualize it, that was something. Nettlefang came out behind them and stopped beside him on the pavement. She had her instrument case over one shoulder and was looking at the street with the expression of someone making a mental checklist and working through it. "Well," Harry said. "Well," she agreed. "What happens now?" "With the scar." "The extraction." "We proceed as planned. The specialist team will be ready within 2 weeks." She looked at him. "The tribunal finding actually helps. It establishes the legal framework for your right to full informed consent and oversight throughout the procedure. Goldthorn will walk you through every step. Nothing happens without your approval." 73%, Harry said. "Still 73%. Goldthorn is not the type to round up for morale purposes." "No," Harry agreed. "I noticed." He paused. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "Before this, before the audit, did you expect this? When you came to Hogwarts for a routine health check, did you expect to end up here?" Nettlefang was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I expected to find Jinx residue and 1 or 2 artifact contamination cases and go home." She adjusted the strap of her instrument case. "But when the instruments showed what they showed, the path was clear. There was no version of finding what I found that didn't lead here. Do you know what I keep thinking about?" Harry said. She waited again. "I keep thinking about all the other students who got examined Friday and had their results filed, and it was normal. Routine. They went to dinner and didn't think about it again." He looked down the street. "That was supposed to be me too. I was on that list. Just another student." "You were never just another student," Nettlefang said, but without the reverent inflection that sentence usually carried when people said it to him. no awe, no particular weight. Just accuracy. Which made it more important, not less, that someone looked at you the same way. Harry looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I've said it before, but you don't need to keep saying it." "I know. I'm saying it because I want to." Something moved in Nettlefang's expression, not sentiment. She wasn't built for sentiment, but the thing adjacent to it that practical people allow themselves in rare moments. "Go home to your school," she said. "Get through your classes. I'll contact you with the extraction schedule." Harry nodded. She nodded back, with the crisp finality of someone closing a professional exchange, and walked away down the pavement with the purposeful stride of someone who had work to do. They took the night bus back. Stan Shunpike was surprised to see 4 people flagging him down on a Whitehall side street on a Friday morning and covered the surprise with his professional welcome speech, which he delivered with slightly less confidence than usual given that Sirius Black was one of the 4. Sirius sat on the upper deck and looked out the window as London lurched and telescoped around them in the night bus's particular geography-defying way, and Harry sat beside him, and Hermione and Ron sat in the seats across the narrow aisle. "I have to go back to the safe house," Sirius said, after a while. "I know. Not yet. I'll go Saturday." He turned from the window. "Today I want to go to Hogsmeade and eat something and talk about something that isn't tribunals." "That sounds brilliant," Ron said, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been in a stone room listening to legal proceedings for 2 days and had reached his limit. Hermione smiled. "We have a Hogsmeade weekend tomorrow anyway." "We could," she stopped. "Oh. What?" Harry said. "Rita Skeeter. They all processed this. The Prophet's going to have the finding by tomorrow," Hermione said, the logistics assembling behind her eyes at speed. Bones said 24 hours. "And the Ministry's been trying to get ahead of the narrative all week." "Let them," Harry said. She looked at him. "You're not worried about how they frame it?" "They can frame it however they want. The finding is the finding. It's on the record." He looked out the window at the lurching London streets. "They'll call it a Goblin overreach. They'll call it a political attack on Dumbledore. They'll find ways to be upset about it for weeks." He paused. "I don't care. I know what it says. Everyone who was in that room knows what it says. And eventually, maybe not now, but eventually, the people who need to know will read it." Ron was looking at him with the expression he wore when Harry said something that surprised him by being more measured than expected. "You've gotten very calm," he said. "It's slightly eerie." "I've been angry for years," Harry said. "It's nice to not be, for a bit." "You're allowed to still be angry," Hermione said. "I am still angry," Harry said. "But it's in the right place now. It has somewhere to go." He watched the city outside the window, foreshortened and strange through the night bus glass. Before, the anger was just, everywhere. At Voldemort, at the Dursleys, at the prophecy, at all of it, and I couldn't pick it up and put it anywhere because I didn't have the full picture. Now I do. He looked at his hands. It's different. It feels workable. Hermione and Ron exchanged a look over the aisle that had a whole conversation in it. Sirius put his arm around Harry's shoulders in the sideways, one-armed way of someone who is affectionate and slightly awkward about it, and Harry leaned into it, and the night bus lurched around a corner and they were suddenly somewhere that looked like a motorway, and then a village, and then somewhere that might have been the outskirts of Hogsmeade. The Daily Prophet ran the story Saturday morning. The headline was, "Gringotts Tribunal Delivers Finding Against Dumbledore, Full Report." It was not, as Harry had expected, framed as an overreach. It was not sensationalized. It was not edited to minimize or redirect. It was, instead, a straightforward news report, 3 full columns, plus an extended summary of the tribunal finding, plus a sidebar that described the accords and their legal basis with a clarity that suggested the journalist had actually read the documents. The byline was not Rita Skeeter's. It was Neville's cousin's friend's mother, who apparently worked as an investigative reporter at the Prophet's offices and had been waiting for exactly this kind of story for 3 years. Harry didn't know any of this when he read it at breakfast. He just read the story and noticed, with a kind of surprised relief, that it was accurate. That it named the 8 anchor points. That it quoted Nettlefang's findings. That it described, plainly, what had been found and what had been ruled. The Great Hall was loud with it. Everyone had the Prophet. The noise level was 3 or 4 times what it usually was on a Saturday morning, and it had a quality Harry recognized as genuine shock, not the performative excitement of gossip, but the specific buzzing disorientation of people encountering information that doesn't fit the shape of the world they thought they were in. McGonagall arrived at the teacher's table and sat down and opened her own copy of the Prophet and read it with the focused attention of someone who already knew approximately what it said and was now determining exactly. When she finished, she set it down beside her tea and looked straight at Harry across the Great Hall with an expression that was complicated and contained and that Harry, looking back at her, felt he understood something of. She had known Dumbledore for 50 years. She had served under him, believed in him, trusted his judgment on things she might otherwise have questioned. And now she was sitting with the same gap that Harry was sitting with, between what a person represented and what they had actually done, and she was managing it with the same composure she brought to everything, which was not the same as it being easy. Harry gave her a small nod. She returned it. Dumbledore didn't come to breakfast. He didn't come to lunch, either. McGonagall presided over both meals from the high table with the composed authority of someone who had been running this school, in practical terms, for decades, and was simply now doing it with formal acknowledgement of that fact. Snape came to both meals. He sat at his usual spot and ate with his usual focused isolation, and if he was aware of the sustained attention the entire school had been directing at the high table since the Prophet arrived, he gave no sign of it. His expression was exactly what it always was, closed, slightly disdainful, profoundly private. Harry watched him over breakfast for a while, trying to put what he now knew alongside the Snape he'd always known and see if they resolved into something coherent. They didn't, quite. Not yet. Maybe not ever, fully. Snape had known since Harry was 4 years old. He had known and had carried it and had confirmed Dumbledore's hypothesis through his access to Voldemort's most private magical records, which was its own particular kind of revelation, the depth of what Snape had risked, the things he'd had access to, the specific hell of being the person who knew the most and could say the least. Harry wasn't ready to forgive him. He wasn't sure forgiveness was the right frame. But the testimony had added a dimension to the picture of Severus Snape that was going to take a while to fully absorb, and in the meantime Harry found himself looking at the man with something other than the reflexive wariness and dislike, which was new and slightly unsettling. At one point during lunch, he looked up and found Snape already looking at him. Snape held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his plate without any discernible expression, and ate his lunch, and that was that. He went to see Dumbledore in the afternoon. He hadn't planned to. He'd spent the morning at Hogsmeade with Ron and Hermione and Neville and Luna, who had attached herself to the group with her particular comfortable randomness and whose complete lack of interest in dramatic reactions to the morning's news had been, Harry found, extremely restful. Luna had read the Prophet over breakfast, said, "Oh, that must be a relief for Harry," and then talked about Nargles for 20 minutes and everyone had been better for it. But walking back up to the castle after Hogsmeade, Harry found that his feet took him toward the gargoyle rather than the Gryffindor Tower, and he stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment and thought about whether he wanted to do this. He did. He wanted to do it now, while the verdict was still fresh and he was still in the particular state of clarity he'd been in since Bones read out the finding, the state of having the full picture, finally, the state of knowing that the thing he'd been carrying had been acknowledged and documented and that he could, now, make choices about what came next. He said the password, it was "lemon drop," which had not changed, and went up. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up when Harry came in, and nothing in his face was surprised. He'd been expecting this, Harry realized, or at least had been sitting with the possibility of it. He had the look of someone who had spent the day in a different kind of deliberation than yesterday's, and who had arrived at something. "Harry," he said. "Please sit down." Harry sat. He looked around the office, the instruments, the portraits of past headmasters, several of whom were ostentatiously asleep, Fawkes on his perch making no sound at all. He'd spent so many hours in this room. So many significant moments of his life had happened in this circular space, under the eye of this particular person. "I read the Prophet this morning," Harry said. "As did I. It's accurate." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "It is." A pause. "I'm not here to apologize for bringing the case," Harry said. "I want to say that plainly." "I wouldn't want you to," Dumbledore said. "It was the right thing to do." Harry looked at him. "Then what do we do? Going forward?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. His hands, folded on the desk, were perfectly still. "That depends, in part, on what you want," he said. "What you need." "What?" He paused. "I was going to say what the war requires. Old habit. What I mean to say is, what is right for you." "That's different," Harry said. "You saying that?" "Yes," Dumbledore agreed. "It is. I hope you'll find it genuine." Harry looked at the desk, at the instruments he'd once shattered in this room with the force of his own grief and fury. They were mended, all of them. Of course they were. "I need to trust that the decisions about how we fight this war, the decisions that involve me, get made with me. Not around me. Not for me." He looked up. "I'm not saying I have all the answers. I'm not saying Nettlefang does, or Sirius does. But I'm saying I need to be in the room." "You will be," Dumbledore said. "I give you my word. Your word means something different to me now than it did a month ago." "I know," Dumbledore said simply. "That is fair. Earn it back or don't, that will be demonstrated through what I do, not what I promise." He looked at Harry with the blue eyes that had always seemed to see further than they should. "I am still invested in ending this war, Harry. I am still committed to helping you survive it. Those two things are no longer in conflict for me, they never should have been." Harry sat with that for a moment. "Nettlefang thinks the extraction will work," he said. 73%. "I know. She sent me the preliminary report." Dumbledore's hands shifted slightly on the desk. "I should tell you, when the methodology report arrived, the one from 2001 outlining the refined extraction procedure, I read it. I understood, immediately, what it meant." He looked at Harry steadily. "I should have brought it to you then. Why didn't you?" A pause. A genuine, searching pause, not a performance of deliberation but actual deliberation. "Because by that time," Dumbledore said slowly, "the strategic model had been in place for so long that I'd stopped questioning its foundations. I saw the extraction report as theoretical. A complication. A thing that was possible in some other version of events." He looked down at his hands. "I had built a story about how this would end, and I was so deep inside that story that new information that contradicted it." He stopped. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation of a failure I am still examining." Harry looked at him. "I don't know if I forgive you yet," Harry said. "I want to be honest about that." "Please be," Dumbledore said. "I don't want your forgiveness if it isn't real. Not on this." They sat in the quiet office for another few minutes. Fawkes made a sound, finally, a single, low, liquid note that didn't resolve into music, just hung in the air. "The extraction," Harry said. "Will you be there? When they do it?" Dumbledore looked at him with something in his face that Harry couldn't quite name but that he recognized as a kind of hope, not the large, strategic, world-shaping hope that Dumbledore usually operated from, but something smaller and more personal. "Do you want me to be?" Harry thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. But I'll tell you when I do. He stood up and left, and the door closed behind him, and he walked back through the castle to Gryffindor Tower with the November cold coming in through the windows and the sounds of the school around him, ordinary, ongoing, unchanged in its surface while everything underneath had shifted. That evening, in the common room, with the fire going and the usual Saturday night noise of the tower filling the space, Hermione put her book down and said, "I keep thinking about something Nettlefang said. At the audit." "Which part?" Harry said. He was on the floor near the fire, back against the armchair Ron was sitting in, half reading a charms essay and half listening to the fire. "She said you're in charge. That you're a patient, not a subject." Hermione turned the spine of her book between her fingers. "I've been thinking about why that mattered so much. Why it hit differently. Because nobody had said it before," Ron said, from above Harry. "Simple." "Yes, but," Hermione was working something through. "It wasn't just that nobody said it. It was that we all just accepted that he wasn't in charge. That the decisions got made elsewhere and he received them. And I helped with that. I helped make it seem like that was fine." She looked at Harry. "I'm still angry with myself about it." "Hermione," Harry said. "I know. I know you've said, you also did everything right," Harry said. "The research, the documentation, the way you helped me give the statement. You've been doing everything right since Friday." He looked at her. "The past thing, I don't need you to keep punishing yourself for it. It doesn't help either of us." She looked at him for a moment. "When did you get emotionally intelligent?" "I've always been emotionally intelligent," Harry said. "I just didn't have the vocabulary." Ron snorted. "That's a lie. In second year you cried about a Quidditch broom." "That was grief," Harry said, with dignity. The fire crackled. The common room filled with the ordinary warm noise of a school Saturday evening, and Harry leaned his head back against the armchair Ron was sitting in and looked at the fire and felt, with a steadiness that surprised him, like himself. Just himself. Complicated and unfinished and carrying several things that were going to take a long time to resolve, but himself. Not a chess piece or a weapon or a symbol. Not the boy who would have to die. Just a person, sitting by a fire, with friends who were genuinely his, with a future that was no longer being managed for him. The finding was on record. The truth was documented. And in 2 weeks, if Goldthorn was right about the 73%, which Harry had decided to believe, not because optimism was easy but because deciding to believe the odds was itself a form of agency, a form of choosing your own story, in 2 weeks, the last pieces of someone else's soul would be removed from his body. And then it would just be him. He looked at the fire and let himself want that. Chapter 6, After the Reckoning. The extraction was scheduled for a Tuesday. Nettlefang had chosen Tuesday deliberately. She'd told Harry this when she sent the scheduling notice, with the same flat candor she brought to everything, explaining that Tuesdays had the lowest rate of emergency interruptions in the division's operational calendar, that Goldthorn performed best in morning sessions, and that the specialist team needed 48 clear hours post-procedure for observation, which a Tuesday start accommodated without disrupting Harry's school week beyond what was necessary. Harry had read this and felt an unexpected rush of affection for the sheer practicality of it. Nettlefang had scheduled his potentially life-altering magical surgery around his class timetable. He went to his classes Monday morning with the particular quality of attention you give ordinary things when you know they might be the last time you experience them in a specific way. Not morbidly, he'd made his peace with the 73% in the way you make peace with odds when the alternative is spending your remaining time in paralysis. But there was something about transfiguration on a Monday morning, with the November light coming grey through the high windows and McGonagall's voice precise and demanding at the front of the room, that he wanted to pay attention to. He sat next to Ron and transformed a teacup into a reasonably convincing tortoise and thought about the fact that by this time tomorrow the 8 anchor points in his scar would either be gone or the extraction would have failed and things would be considerably more complicated. Ron nudged him. "Your tortoise is crying." Harry looked down. His tortoise had somehow retained the teacup's handle as a kind of structural protrusion and was, in the way of imperfectly transfigured objects, leaking water from it. "It's fine," Harry said. "It's weeping, mate." "Symbolically appropriate," Hermione murmured from Harry's other side without looking up from her own, flawless tortoise. Harry transfigured the handle away and his tortoise stopped leaking and sat on the desk looking at him with the glassy, indeterminate expression of a magical object that doesn't quite know what it is. He looked back at it. "Yeah," he said quietly, to the tortoise. "Me too." McGonagall stopped him after class. The others filed out, Ron and Hermione with the synchronized awareness of people who read the situation correctly, and Harry stood at the front of the room while she tidied her desk with precise, unhurried movements, the way she always did, the habitual orderliness that was somehow one of the most reassuring things about her. Then she looked up. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she sometimes had, the one that existed beneath the professional manner, that you only saw when she wasn't working to conceal it, that had always made Harry feel seen in a particular way, as a person rather than a problem to be managed. "How are you feeling about it?" "Honestly?" "Ready," he said. "I've been ready since the moment Nettlefang told me it was possible." He paused. "Not because I'm not scared. I am. He considered the fear, held it up and looked at it. "I'm scared in the way you're scared before something real. Not the way I used to be scared, which was more like, being scared because I didn't know what I was walking into and nobody would tell me." McGonagall's jaw shifted very slightly. "Yes," she said quietly. "I imagine the difference is significant." "It is." He picked up his bag. "I wanted to say, this year, since everything, you've been," he stopped, finding the words imprecise. "You've been good, Professor. You've been fair. And I know this whole thing put you in a difficult position, with Dumbledore, and with the school, and, Harry," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, the same way she occasionally deployed his first name, that meant stop being careful and say the thing. "Albus is my oldest colleague and one of the most brilliant people I have ever known, and what was done, what was allowed to happen, to you, was wrong. These are not complicated, contradictory facts. I can hold them simultaneously." She straightened a piece of parchment on her desk. "I intend to." Harry nodded. "I know," he said. "That's why I said you've been good." She looked at him for a beat longer, then picked up a stack of essays with the brisk motion of someone returning to work. "Go and have dinner. Sleep if you can. And come back whole, please. I've invested considerable effort in your transfiguration education and I'd prefer not to start over with someone else." Harry was halfway to the door before the almost smile caught up with him. "Yes, Professor," he said. Sirius came to Hogwarts that evening. Not to the castle proper. McGonagall had arranged it with the particular quiet efficiency she'd been arranging things with since the tribunal, a meeting room in Hogsmeade, the 3 broomsticks cleared of its usual custom for an hour. Harry arrived to find Sirius already there with a bottle of butterbeer open in front of him and a fire going and his formal robes replaced with something more ordinary, the slightly worn jacket and jeans of someone who was, tonight, not attending anything official but simply being present for something personal. He stood when Harry came in. They looked at each other for a second. "You don't have to say anything meaningful," Harry said. "I know you want to. You don't have to." Sirius laughed, a real laugh, slightly startled out of him. "How do you know I was going to say something meaningful? You had the face." "I don't have a face." "You absolutely have a face." Sirius sat down and pushed the spare butterbeer across the table. Harry sat down and picked it up and they drank for a while in the comfortable way of people who have gotten past the need to fill every silence, which was a thing that had happened gradually and quietly between them over the past several weeks and that Harry valued more than he knew how to say. "I'll be at the division tomorrow," Sirius said. "Outside." "In the corridor," if they'll let me, or in the waiting room if they won't. But I'll be there. I know, Harry said. Your mum used to say. Sirius stopped. Tried again. She had this thing she used to say when James was being particularly stupid about taking risks. She'd say, you don't get to be brave and be alone at the same time. Pick one. And she meant that if you were going to do something terrifying, you were going to damn well let the people who loved you stand next to you while you did it. He looked at his butterbeer. She was usually right. Harry turned his bottle in his hands. She sounds like she was a lot. Lily Evans was the most formidable person I ever met, Sirius said, with absolute conviction. And that is saying something, because I once watched Nettlefang Ashgrip cross-examine a ministry barrister into complete incoherence, so the bar is currently very high. Harry smiled. They would have liked each other. Oh, catastrophically, Sirius agreed. The combined force of those two in a room would have been, he shook his head. Governments would have fallen. They sat with that for a while. The fire went on burning. Outside, Hogsmeade was quiet in the way of small places on cold November evenings, and the three broomsticks smelled of butterbeer and old wood and the accumulated warmth of thousands of evenings exactly like this one. I'm going to be okay, Harry said. Not because he needed Sirius to believe it, but because saying it out loud felt important. Like a declaration rather than a reassurance. Whatever happens tomorrow, I intend to come out of it fine, because the odds are good and I trust Goldthorn, but even if it's complicated, I'm going to be okay. I'm not. He thought of the graveyard, of the long shadow of an ending he'd been walking toward without knowing it. I'm not walking into this like it's the last thing. I'm walking into it like it's the first thing. Sirius looked at him with something in his expression that was too full for casual examination and that he seemed to know was too full, so he looked at the fire instead. Yeah, he said, in a voice that was doing its best but not entirely succeeding. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Sirius. I'm fine. I know you are, Harry said. It's okay to also not be entirely fine. Sirius pressed his mouth together. Nodded once, tightly, at the fire. When did you get emotionally intelligent? Hermione asked me that yesterday. What did you tell her? I told her I've always been emotionally intelligent. I just didn't have the vocabulary. Sirius laughed again, the same startled, genuine sound, and this time it stayed in the room for a while. He slept. He'd half expected not to, had expected a repeat of the previous sleepless night, the ceiling staring, the thoughts accumulating in the dark. But he lay down and the exhaustion of weeks settled over him with a completeness that felt, oddly, like trust, and he was asleep before the dormitory had gone fully quiet. He dreamed about his parents, which didn't happen often and which when it did happen usually came with an ache that persisted into waking. But this was a quiet dream, not the terrible priori incantatum echo of the graveyard, not his mother's voice from behind a closed door. Just his parents, in a garden he didn't recognize, James sitting in the grass with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and Lily beside him, and the quality of light that meant late afternoon in summer, long shadows, and gold warmth, and nothing happening, just the two of them being alive somewhere that was peaceful. He stood in the dream at the edge of the garden and looked at them. His father turned and saw him and grinned, the easy, quick grin he'd seen in photographs, the grin that was apparently identical to his own. He raised one hand in a wave that was completely unsolemn, completely casual, the wave of a person who is glad to see you and not particularly surprised. His mother looked over and her expression was, he couldn't hold on to it exactly, it kept shifting as he tried to look at it directly, but it was warm and fierce and very her, the quality he'd always imagined she had from the way other people described her. He woke up at 6 in the morning with the dream still on him, not like a weight but like warmth, and lay for a minute with it before it faded. Then he got up. The division room had been prepared differently for the extraction. The flat white light was the same, but the space had been reconfigured, the examination table replaced with something that was more properly a treatment bed, elevated and padded and positioned in the center of the room with the careful deliberateness of people who had spent considerable time thinking about ergonomics and access angles. 4 stations had been set up around it, one for Goldthorn, one for the junior specialist, one for each of the registry consultants who still didn't share names and who Harry had stopped being unsettled by and had started thinking of as simply part of the professional landscape. Nettlefang stood at the head of the bed. She had the role, Harry understood, of primary patient monitor. She would watch him rather than the procedure, tracking his vitals and magical output throughout. Sirius was in the corridor outside. Hermione and Ron were in the waiting room 2 doors down. Harry had said goodbye to them in the way of people who fully intended to be fine and were also acknowledging that goodbyes before significant things mattered regardless. Hermione had hugged him so hard he'd felt his ribs. Ron had shaken his hand, then pulled him into the hug too, because Ron Weasley did not do things by half when they counted. Harry lay down on the treatment bed and looked at the white ceiling and felt the room around him, the specific people in it, their particular competencies, the careful preparation evident in every arranged instrument and cleared space, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Safe. Not safe in the way that meant nothing could go wrong. Safe in the way that meant the people around him were the right people, were skilled and present and honest about what they knew and what they didn't, and were going to do everything possible to give the 73% its best chance. It was different from every other time he'd faced something dangerous. Every other time there had been running, reaction, improvisation in the dark. This was chosen. Planned. Attended by people who had prepared properly and who were going to tell him the truth at every stage. He turned his head and looked at Nettlefang. "Ready," he said. "Good," she said. She held his gaze for a second with the directness she'd had since the first day, the particular quality of attention that did not flinch or soften or perform itself. "If at any point you need to stop, you say so." "I know." "Then let's begin." The extraction took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Harry was conscious for parts of it and in a state of deep magical sedation for other parts. Goldthorn had explained this beforehand, that the procedure required alternating between active patient participation and sedated passivity, that the fragments would respond differently to conscious versus sedated magical field conditions, that he would feel some of what happened and not feel other parts. What he felt, when he felt it, was strange rather than painful. The pressure he remembered from the assessment sessions, multiplied, a sense of things being carefully, precisely pulled from somewhere deep, not torn, nothing so crude as that, but drawn out the way you draw a thread through fabric by finding the right angle and applying the right tension. There were moments of cold, and moments of warmth, and once a sensation like the inside of his skull briefly resonating at a frequency he couldn't hear but could feel in his back teeth. There was a moment, he couldn't place it in the sequence, the sedation had disordered his sense of time, when he felt something release. The only way he could describe it afterward was, like a door opening that he hadn't known was closed. A sudden absence of something he'd been so accustomed to carrying that he'd stopped registering its weight. A silence in a particular frequency of his own mind that had always previously had something in it, something watchful and alien and deep, and now was simply quiet. He felt tears on his face and didn't know when they'd started. He heard Nettlefang say, quietly, to someone else in the room, "Vital response normal. Continue." And then the procedure moved on, and he let it, and the strange sensations continued and he was in sedation for a while and then not, and at some point the 4 hours were over and Goldthorn said, "That's the last one," and the room was very still. He lay on the treatment bed and looked at the white ceiling and waited to see what he felt like. He felt like himself. But himself differently, like a room that has had its furniture rearranged to how it was supposed to be, everything in the right place, the proportions suddenly making sense. He moved his hand and it was his hand. He thought a thought and it was his thought, only his, no undercurrent of something else running alongside it. He pressed 2 fingers against his scar. It was there, the narrow ridge of it, familiar, part of his face. It would always be there. It would always be the mark of the night his parents died, the shape of the thing that had started all of this. But it was just a scar. Just his. He started laughing. Not from relief, exactly, though relief was part of it. Not from joy, though that was there too. It was more complicated than either of those things, the specific, slightly unhinged laughter of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has just put it down and discovered that their arms still work. Nettlefang looked at him. "Sorry," he managed. "Don't apologize," she said. And then, with the closest thing to warmth he'd heard from her, which was still relatively dry but was real, it worked. Goldthorn was already reviewing the post-procedure readings with the junior specialist, but he looked over at those words and gave a single measured nod that Harry chose to interpret as satisfaction. The registry consultants were packing their instruments with the same wordless efficiency they'd brought to everything and gave no particular sign of reaction, which was fine, that was their way. "All 8? Harry said. "All 8, Nettlefang confirmed. "Completely extracted. The anchor points are dissipated. The magical tissue shows normal residual scarring, same as any old curse mark, and nothing else." She picked up her monitoring instrument. "How do you feel?" "Like myself," Harry said. "For the first time, maybe ever, just like myself." Nettlefang looked at him for a moment with the expression that wasn't quite sentiment but was the nearest she came to it. "Good," she said. He went out to the corridor and Sirius was there. He was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set and the particular expression of someone who has been standing in a corridor for 4 hours and a bit, burning through the hours with sheer stubborn presence. When the door opened and Harry walked out, he stood up straight and looked at Harry's face, and whatever he saw there, the laughter still around the edges, maybe, or something looser in the way Harry was standing, or just the fact that Harry was upright and walking and there, something released in him too. "Well," he said. "All 8, Harry said. "It worked." Sirius closed the distance between them in 2 steps and pulled him into a hug that had everything in it: the 19 hours waiting for the verdict, the letter he'd read at the safe house, the letter he'd written in the cold Highland morning with his hands shaking, all 12 years of Azkaban and the 2 years after it, and the whole long wait of being the person who was supposed to be taking care of this boy and hadn't been able to, and now could, now that it was almost over. Harry hugged him back with both arms and felt the warmth of it and the reality of it and thought about his father waving from a dream garden and didn't try to hold the feeling at arm's length. When they separated, Sirius's eyes were doing something that he was managing with determined dignity. He cleared his throat. "Right," he said. "Right," Harry agreed. 48 hours of observation, Sirius said, pulling himself together. "I read the protocol. You're here until Thursday. You don't have to stay." "I'm staying," Sirius said, with the finality he'd used when he'd said "I'll be in the corridor" on the morning of the extraction. "Find me a chair and point me at a room." "I'm staying." Nettlefang appeared in the doorway. She looked at Sirius. "There's a consultation room 2 doors down with adequate seating and a tea service," she said. "You can stay there." Sirius looked at her. "Thank you," he said, the same simple direct way he'd said it after she confirmed the findings, with the same absolute sincerity. "The observation will begin in 20 minutes, she said. "He needs to eat something first." On Wednesday evening, during the 48-hour observation, Harry sat in the consultation room with Sirius and Hermione and Ron. They'd been allowed in for visiting hours, which Nettlefang had established as 2 hours in the afternoon and 2 hours in the evening, with the clinical practicality of someone who believed that social support was a genuine component of recovery and was allocating it accordingly. And they ate sandwiches and talked. Not about the war. Not about Voldemort, still out there, still building, still waiting in whatever dark place Dark Lords waited while their plans matured. Not about the Horcruxes that still existed beyond the ones that had been in Harry's scar. Not about prophecies or strategies or what came next in the long, grinding work of ending a war that had been running since before any of them were born. They talked about Quidditch. They talked about whether Ron and Lavender Brown were actually going to happen. Ron went pink and said absolutely not with insufficient conviction. They talked about Hagrid's new creatures for care of magical creatures, which were apparently causing minor property damage to the greenhouses again. Hermione talked for 20 minutes about a book she'd found in the division's waiting room library, which turned out to be a Goblin historical record from the 15th century that she had become genuinely gripped by despite, or possibly because of, being able to read only about a third of the language. Sirius told them stories about the Marauders. He'd been doing this more, lately, since the tribunal, since the thing between him and Harry had shifted into something less fraught and more simply warm. He'd been more willing to bring out the stories, to let James and Lily and Peter and his own younger self into the room without the complicated grief that used to accompany it making everything heavier. He told them about the time James had tried to enchant Professor Binz's chalk to write increasingly dramatic messages on the board while he lectured, and the chalk had exceeded its enchantment parameters and written an entire short story across 4 blackboards before anyone could stop it. He told them about Lily hexing James into speaking exclusively in questions for 3 days as punishment for something Harry's father had done that Sirius was vague about, possibly because it involved him. He told them about Remus and the secret stash of chocolate he'd maintained in the Shrieking Shack, which none of them had known about for 3 years and which, when discovered, had turned out to be enormous. Harry listened and laughed and ate his sandwich and felt, with a completeness that had nothing wistful about it, the sadness was there. It would always be there, but it was the right size now, the size of grief rather than the size of a wound, the presence of his parents in the stories. Not their absence. Their presence. The specific people they had been, funny and stubborn and human, who had loved each other and loved Sirius and had made a life that had produced Harry, and who had died protecting what they loved. He was going to finish this. He was going to find the remaining Horcruxes, and with the formal legal structure the Accords had created around his welfare, with Nettlefang's division involved, with Goldthorn's expertise available, with Sirius no longer in hiding and McGonagall formally in charge of his educational welfare and the truth on the record, he was going to do it differently than he would have done it before. Not alone. Not in the dark. Not walking toward an ending someone else had already written for him. He was going to do it as himself. Fully himself, for the first time. Thursday morning, Nettlefang signed off on the observation. She did it with the same clinical efficiency with which she did everything, reviewed the final monitoring readings, completed the documentation, made 3 additional notes in her practitioner's record. Then she turned to Harry and said, "You're clear. Magically stable. Scar residue is benign old curse mark, nothing else. The Accord's protection status remains active for a further 12 months. And after 12 months? We reassess. If you're still in an active conflict situation, it extends." She looked at him steadily. The protection status means what it always meant, no strategic decisions about your physical welfare without your informed consent and division oversight. That doesn't change. Harry nodded. What about Voldemort? The remaining Horcruxes? He'd been thinking about this through the 48 hours, turning it over, and he wanted to ask her directly. Does the protection status affect how we go after them? Nettlefang was quiet for a moment. The division's mandate is your physical safety and welfare. It is not the prosecution of the war. She met his eyes. But the division has resources. The artifact records, which are more complete than the ministry's. The dark magic containment expertise. If you wanted that expertise applied to the problem of locating and destroying Horcruxes, formally, with documentation, with proper oversight, she paused. That is something you could request. As a formal patient protection case. Harry looked at her. Something clicked into place. Gringotts has records that the ministry doesn't. Artifact histories. Dark magic lineages. The Riddle family vault was held here, Brasswick said from the doorway. He'd come in for the sign-off, as he had for every procedural milestone. Tom Riddle, later known as Voldemort, conducted several transactions through Gringotts in the 1940s and 1950s. Some of those records relate to specific magical artifacts. He adjusted his glasses with the precise movement of a man who has been waiting to say something. Our records policy requires that such information be held confidentially unless subject to a formal legal petition. He looked at Harry over his glasses. A formal protection case under the Accords constitutes exactly such a petition. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Sirius, who had been standing in the doorway beside Brasswick and whose expression had gone through several rapid stages and arrived at something that looked like the beginning of a plan. "Sirius," Harry said. "You still have access to the Black family library? Every dark artifact catalog, every lineage record, every piece of correspondence dating back to the 14th century, Sirius confirmed. And before you ask, yes. Absolutely yes." Hermione made a sound from her corner of the room that was unmistakably the sound of someone whose intellectual appetite had just been given a very large meal to work with. She had her notebook out before anyone had finished speaking. "All right," Harry said. He turned back to Nettlefang and Brasswick. "How do we do this properly?" They spent 3 hours in the consultation room with Brasswick's documentation team laying the groundwork. It was, Harry thought, watching the process unfold, watching Hookwhistle arrive with his too large briefcase, watching Hermione and Brasswick fall into a rapid, intensely focused exchange about vault transaction records, watching Sirius walk Nettlefang through what he knew of the objects Voldemort had been known to covet, the most different this had ever felt. Not just different from the frantic, improvised quality of his previous years, the running and reacting and operating on incomplete information in the dark. Different from even the last few weeks, which had been about accountability for the past. This was about what came next. And what came next was being built by people who were choosing it together, in a room with good lighting, with documentation that would hold up, with a legal structure that protected Harry as a person rather than managing him as an asset. It was imperfect. Voldemort was not going to be stopped by paperwork, the physical reality of the war was still brutal and dangerous and real, but the structure under it was sound for the first time, and structure, Harry had learned, mattered enormously when everything started shaking. Ron, who had no particular gift for archival research and knew it, had installed himself next to Sirius and was being quietly useful in the way he was always quietly useful when he stopped worrying about whether he was being useful enough, asking the right questions at the right moments, keeping the temperature in the room from going too high when the conversation about the Black family records got complicated, passing people tea without being asked. At one point, Harry looked up from the vault transaction record he was reading and found Sirius watching him with an expression that was simply proud. Not the complicated, freighted version of parental pride that came with grief attached. Just clean and straightforward and warm. Harry looked back at the record. Then he looked up again. "The cup," he said. "The Hufflepuff cup. The transaction records from 1946, it shows a purchase by a T.M. Riddle. An artifact acquisition." He looked at Brasswick. "It went out of Gringotts records in 1979. Which means someone took it out of a vault in 1979. Bellatrix Lestrange opened a new vault in 1979, Brasswick said, without looking up from his own papers. The room went very quiet. "The cup is in Lestrange's vault," Hermione said. Slowly. "Working through it. It's been there all along." "It has been in a Gringotts vault," Brasswick said carefully, with the precise neutrality of a man navigating an institution's competing obligations in real time, since 1979. The question of what happens next is subject to formal legal petition, which, given the active protection case and the Accord's mandate, would carry significant weight. "How long would that petition take?" Harry said. "Significantly less time," Brasswick said, with the same careful precision, than it took to get a tribunal convened. He looked at Harry over his glasses. "I would say, a week, perhaps, to do it properly." Harry looked around the table. At Sirius. At Hermione, who had her quill moving already. At Ron, who had set down his tea and was sitting forward with the focused attention he saved for things that mattered. At Nettlefang, who was reading the vault transaction record Harry had been looking at with the expression she wore when processing information that was confirming something she'd hypothesized. "A week," Harry said. "Properly. With documentation, with oversight, with the division involved." "Yes," Brasswick said. "Okay," Harry said. "Then let's do it properly." He walked out of the division building at 4 in the afternoon into the cold November street, and the city was doing what cities do, going on, entirely self-sufficient, full of people doing specific and ordinary things with their specific and ordinary lives. He stood on the pavement for a moment. Sirius came out behind him and stood beside him, and Hermione and Ron came behind them, and they all stood in a loose cluster on the Whitehall pavement in the late afternoon like people who have just come out of something significant and haven't quite reoriented to the world yet. "Well," Ron said. "Well," Sirius agreed. "We should eat," Hermione said. "Properly eat, not hospital sandwiches." She looked around as if she could locate a restaurant by force of intellect. "There's a place on the Strand that's not wizarding," Harry said. "Not wizarding," she confirmed. "Completely ordinary. They do an exceptional pasta." Ron brightened perceptibly. "I'm in favor of completely ordinary." Harry looked at the street. The ordinary, indifferent, ongoing street, full of people who had no idea what was happening underneath the surface of the world they lived in, which was fine, that was fine, they didn't need to know, they were living their lives and that was what lives were for. He thought of Voldemort, still out there. Still waiting. Still dangerous in a way that hadn't changed because of any of this, that was still going to require everything Harry had and probably things he didn't know he had yet. He thought of the cup in Bellatrix's vault. He thought of the petition Hookwhistle was already drafting. He thought of the Black family library, which Sirius had described as catastrophically well-stocked in dark magic history, with the combination of pride and shame that the ancestral family home produced in him. He thought of Nettlefang reviewing vault transaction records with the focused certainty of someone who has found the thread and intends to follow it all the way. He thought of his parents in the dream garden, his father's easy wave, his mother's expression that he couldn't hold directly but knew was warm and fierce and entirely her. He was 16 years old. There was a war to end. There were Horcruxes to find and destroy through proper channels with proper oversight and the full resources of institutions that were, finally, pointed in the right direction. There was Voldemort, and the prophecy, and all of the hard, dangerous, unfinished work of being the person this had happened to and the person it was going to have to be resolved through. But right now there was an ordinary restaurant on the Strand and people who were going to sit across from him and eat pasta and talk about something other than dark magic, and that, the simple, specific reality of that, was enough for this moment. "Come on then," Harry said. He stepped off the pavement and walked into the street, and Sirius fell into step on his left and Ron on his right and Hermione just slightly ahead the way she always was, navigating, and the city moved around them, and above London the November sky was doing something almost interesting with the clouds and the last of the afternoon light, going orange at the edges of the grey in the way that November sometimes surprised you with, brief and cold and entirely itself. 3 weeks later, the cup came out of Bellatrix Lestrange's vault. It came out legally, under formal petition, with documentation and oversight and a Gringotts retrieval team accompanied by 2 members of the Magical Health and Artifacts Division and 1 representative from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Amelia Bones had personally assigned that representative, which said everything about where she stood. It came out without a break-in, without a dragon, without anyone running through tunnels on a cart with their heart in their throat. It came out because the law, carefully applied, was a more powerful instrument than most people gave it credit for. Harry held the cup for 30 seconds in the division's containment room, in the flat white light, with Nettlefang beside him and Goldthorn's instruments running the verification protocol, and he felt the dark resonance of it from 2 feet away, the particular malevolent weight of a Horcrux, recognizable now that the 8 in his scar were gone, the way you recognize a smell more clearly after you've cleared the air. "Confirmed," Goldthorn said. Harry handed it to the containment specialist and stepped back and breathed. 1 down. Several more to find. A war still running. But the ground under his feet was solid now in a way it had never been before, not because the danger was gone but because the people standing on it with him were honest and competent and had agreed to do this properly, and properly turned out to be a word with real weight when you'd spent 16 years operating in the absence of it. He was the boy who lived. He'd always hated that name, hated the shape of it, the passivity of it, as if survival were something that happened to you rather than something you chose, repeatedly, in the small decisions and the large ones, in the decision to ask a goblin healer what she'd found and in the decision to trust the 73% and in the decision to walk into a tribunal room and say it was my life, my choice. He was still him. Still the boy with the broken glasses and the untidy hair and the scar that would always be there, that was just a scar now, that was his. Still the person who'd grown up in a cupboard and found out at 11 that the world was larger than anyone had told him and had spent 5 years running to catch up. But he was running differently now. Forward, finally. With his eyes open. With the full picture. With people around him who were going to tell him the truth even when the truth was 8 points of reddish light on a detection disc in the middle of a great hall partition, even when the truth was testimony that cost something to give, even when the truth arrived in the form of a unanimous finding read by a woman with a monocle in a room that didn't officially exist. The truth had always been there. It had just needed someone to document it. Nettlefang Ashgrip had walked into Hogwarts on a Tuesday in October looking for Jinx residue, and she'd found something that changed everything, and she had not paused, or hesitated, or decided that the discomfort of what she'd found was someone else's problem. She had opened her case, changed her settings, and started writing. Harry looked at the containment room around him, the clean white light, the orderly instruments, the properly sealed container now holding the cup. He looked at Nettlefang, who was making notes with the angular script that wrote faster than her hand seemed to be moving, already on to the next thing, the next step in the properly documented process of ending this war correctly. "What's next?" he said. She looked up. "We review the vault transaction records through 1980. There are 3 more anomalies that Brasswick flagged." She turned the document toward him. "Sit down. This will take a while." Harry pulled up a chair. He sat down. He got to work.